Tonight, we're uncovering the dark truth about the Dance of the Dragons. This is a topic with a lot to uncover, but I'll keep my narration calm so you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Imagine a world where the horizon is never empty. If you look up at the clouds over the narrow sea, or the jagged peaks of the Moon Mountains, you don't just see birds or the shifting patterns of the weather. You see gold, you see silver, deep crimson, and a black so profound it seems to swallow the sun. This was the world of House Targaryen at its absolute zenith. For over a century, the descendants of Aegon the Conqueror had not just ruled Westeros, they had reshaped it in their image. They were more than kings. With the blood of old Valyria flowing through their veins and the fire of dragons at their command, they were effectively gods walking among men. The Seven Kingdoms had known peace under the long, steady reign of the old king, Jaehaerys, and his successor, Viserys I. It was a time of overflowing treasuries, grand tournaments, and a sense of permanence that felt as unshakable as the wall in the far north. But beneath this golden exterior, a rot was forming. It was a rot born of pride, of ancient tradition clashing with royal decree, and a family that had grown too large for its own safety. When we speak of the Dance of the Dragons, we aren't just talking about a war. We are talking about the moment the world changed forever. It is the story of how a single family, possessed of the greatest power the world had ever seen, decided to turn that power inward. It is a story of brothers against sisters, of dragons tearing the throats out of their own kin in the open sky, and of a crown that became so heavy it crushed everyone who tried to wear it. Before this conflict, there were 20 dragons soaring over the continent. By the time the fires burned out and the last sword was sheathed, that number had dwindled to almost nothing. The magic that had sustained the Targaryen dynasty for generations didn't just fade, it was slaughtered. The tragedy begins with a choice. King Viserys I was a man who loved peace, perhaps to a fault. He sat upon the Iron Throne and saw a kingdom that was thriving, but he failed to see the daggers being sharpened in the shadows of his own court. His first wife, Heir Apparent, had given him a daughter, Rhaenyra. She was the joy of his life, a girl who rode the dragon Syrax and was hailed as the realm's delight. When Aemma died and no male heir survived her, Viserys did something unprecedented. He named her as his official heir. He gathered the great lords of Westeros, the Starks, the Lannisters, the Baratheons, and the Arryns, and he made them kneel. He made them swear sacred oaths that they would defend Rhaenyra's right to rule. In that moment, the future of the Seven Kingdoms seemed certain. A queen would sit upon the Iron Throne for the first time in history. But peace is a fragile thing, and the human heart is often governed by ambition rather than oaths. When Viserys remarried, choosing Alicent Hightower as his second queen, the seeds of destruction were sown. Alicent was the daughter of the Hand of the King, Otto Hightower, a man whose political instincts were as sharp as Valyrian steel. Soon, the halls of the Red Keep were no longer filled with the laughter of a unified family. Instead, they were filled with two rival factions. On one side were the Blacks, those who remained loyal to Rhaenyra and the king's original decree. On the other were the Greens, those who gathered around Queen Alicent and her children. They argued that a woman could never truly sit the throne, that ancient Andal tradition dictated a son must always come before a daughter, regardless of what a king might say. As Viserys grew old and his health began to fail, the tension reached a breaking point. The King's Council became a battlefield of whispers. Every glance in the corridors of King's Landing carried the weight of a death threat. When the king finally drew his last breath in the year 129 after the conquest, the world held its breath. The Greens didn't announce his death immediately. Instead, they locked the gates. They silenced the bells. Behind closed doors, they plotted a coup that would set the sky on fire. They crowned Alicent's eldest son, Aegon II, in a hurried ceremony, while Rhaenyra remained miles away on Dragonstone, unaware that her father was dead and her birthright had been stolen. This is the dark truth of the dance. It wasn't a war fought for the good of the realm. It wasn't a crusade against a tyrant or a defense against an invading army. It was a family feud that escalated into a continental catastrophe. It was the moment the Targaryens forgot the very thing that made them special. They forgot that they were the blood of the dragon, and that a dragon does not thrive when it is forced to eat its own heart. The war that followed would claim the lives of thousands. It would see cities burned to ash, and the great houses of Westeros forced to choose sides in a conflict where there were no true heroes, only survivors. The stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just about who sat on a chair made of swords. It was about the survival of magic itself. The dragons were the source of Targaryen dominance, the physical manifestation of their power. Without them, they were just men and women with silver hair and purple eyes. And yet, in their fury, they used these magnificent creatures as if they were common arrows in a quiver. They sent them into battles where dragon fought dragon, fire met fire, and the very air turned to liquid heat. The carnage was so absolute that it fundamentally altered the DNA of the Seven Kingdoms. The Age of Dragons was ending, not with a whimper, but with a roar of agony that echoed from the stepstones to the wall. As we dive into this history, we have to ask ourselves, what drives people to destroy the very things they love? Why did Rhaenyra and Aegon, two people who shared the same father, choose to burn the world down rather than share it? We will look at the pivotal moments that defined the war. We will examine the Battle of the Burning Mill, where the first blood was spilled in the dirt of the Riverlands. We will talk about the Butcher's Ball, a massacre that showed just how low the chivalry of Westeros had fallen. We will explore the sowing of the Dragonseeds, a desperate and dangerous gamble where common bastards were given the chance to tame the most powerful weapons in existence. But most importantly, we will look at the human cost. We will look at the grief of a mother losing her sons, the madness of a prince seeking glory in the clouds, and the silent suffering of the small folk who had no say in the games of their masters, but paid the highest price. The Dance of the Dragons is a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that power, when left unchecked by mercy or wisdom, eventually consumes itself. It is the story of the end of a golden age and the beginning of a long, slow decline that would eventually lead to the fall of the most powerful dynasty the world had ever known. In the hours ahead, we will walk through the smoke and the shadows of this great civil war. We will stand on the walls of King's Landing as the dragons approach. We will sail with the sea snake into the heart of the naval blockades. We will feel the cold winds of the north as the Starks begin their long march south. This is a journey through a time of legends and monsters, where the line between the two became blurred beyond recognition. So, settle in. Let the weight of the day fade away as we travel back nearly 200 years before the birth of Daenerys Targaryen, to a time when the sky was full of wings and the world was on the brink of a fire from which it would never truly recover. The air in the Red Keep during those final days of King Viserys was thick with the scent of old parchment and the heavy incense used to mask the smell of the king's decaying flesh. It was a palace of ghosts, long before the first sword was drawn. You can almost hear the soft footsteps of Sir Criston Cole, the Kingmaker, as he moved through the darkened hallways, making the alliances that would eventually shatter the peace. You can imagine the fear in the eyes of the servants who knew that a storm was coming, a storm that no roof could protect them from. When we think about the factions, the Blacks and the Greens, it is easy to want to pick a side. We want to believe in the righteousness of Rhaenyra's claim, the legitimacy of the king's spoken word, and the tragedy of a woman whose path to power was blocked by the glass ceiling of tradition, or perhaps the logic of the Greens, the desire for stability, and the fear of a succession that broke with 1,000 years of established law. But the dark truth is that both sides were stained. Both sides allowed their shadows to lead them. The war wasn't a clash of light and dark, it was a clash of two different shades of grey, both of which would eventually turn to the black of charcoal. The dragons themselves are perhaps the most tragic figures in this entire saga. Creatures like Vhagar, the ancient she-dragon who had flown with Visenya during the conquest, were forced into a war they didn't understand. Vhagar was a living relic, a mountain of scales and fire that had seen the birth of the Seven Kingdoms. To see her used to slaughter her own descendants is a testament to the vanity of the Targaryen princes. Then there was Sunfire, said to be the most beautiful dragon ever to grace the skies, with scales of shimmering gold and wings of pale pink. his fate, and the fate of his rider Aegon, serves as a brutal reminder that beauty offers no protection against the cruelty of war. As the conflict progressed, the very nature of Westeros began to shift. The great houses found themselves trapped in a web of obligations and ancient grudges. The Brackens and the Blackwoods, houses that had been feuding for thousands of years, saw the dance as just another excuse to continue their endless cycle of violence. The Starks of Winterfell, usually removed from the politics of the South, were pulled into the fray by a pact of ice and fire, bringing the grim determination of the North to the sun-drenched fields of the Reach. The Dance of the Dragons was also a war of secrets. It was a war of ravens carrying messages that changed the fate of empires, and of assassins moving in the dead of night. The event known as Blood and Cheese remains one of the most horrifying chapters in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, a moment of such pure, calculated cruelty that it changed the tone of the war from a political struggle to a vendetta of pure hatred. It was the moment when any hope for a peaceful resolution died, replaced by a singular, burning desire for revenge. We must also consider the role of the Dragonseeds. These were the men and women of humble birth who carried the hidden spark of Valyrian blood. In a moment of desperation, Rhaenyra opened the Dragonmont on Dragonstone to anyone who dared to try and claim a mount. It was a moment of social upheaval that threatened to overturn the entire hierarchy of the world. What happens when a peasant gains the power of a god? The results were as unpredictable as they were devastating. Some, like Adam of the Hull, proved to be more loyal than the highest-born lords. Others, like Hugh Hammer and Ulf the White, showed that power does not grant virtue, only the ability to act on one's darkest impulses. By the time we reach the end of this story, the landscape of Westeros is unrecognizable. The Great Dragonpit in King's Landing, once a symbol of the Targaryens' majesty, becomes a tomb. The Iron Throne, which was forged in dragonfire, becomes the very thing that consumes the dynasty. The crowning of Aegon III, the broken king, marks the end of the fighting, but it is a hollow victory. He inherited a kingdom of ashes, a family of shadows, and a world where the last few dragons were stunted, twisted versions of their ancestors. The dark truth of the Dance of the Dragons is that it was a self-inflicted wound. It was the moment the Targaryens proved they were their own worst enemies. They had no rivals who could match them. No foreign army could have crossed the sea and toppled them. No rebellion of lords could have stood against the combined fire of 20 dragons. They could only be destroyed from within, and they were. As we move forward tonight, keep that thought in your mind. The story we are about to tell is a grand epic, filled with heroism and villainy, but at its heart, it is a funeral dirge. It is the song of a dying fire. We will look at the maps, the lineages, and the battle plans, but we will never lose sight of the fact that this is a tragedy of the highest order. It is the story of how the House of the Dragon danced itself to death. The sun is setting on the reign of Viserys I. The bells are about to toll. The dragons are restless in their stalls, sensing the tension in the air. The lords are gathering their banners, and the queens are preparing their children for a world that will have no mercy for them. The stage is set, the players are in position, and the music is beginning to play. It is time to step into the fire. It is time to witness the dance. Throughout this deep dive, we will explore the nuances that the history books often gloss over. We will look at the psychological toll of the crown, the way the Iron Throne itself seemed to reject those it deemed unworthy, cutting them with its jagged edges. We will talk about the prophecies that haunted the Targaryens, the song of ice and fire that Aegon the Conqueror whispered to his heirs, and how that sacred duty was lost in the noise of the civil war. Was the dance the reason the world was so unprepared for the return of the White Walkers centuries later? Did the loss of the dragons leave the realm vulnerable to the cold that was always coming? We will also spend time with the dragons themselves, not just as weapons, but as sentient beings with their own personalities and bonds. The relationship between a dragon and its rider is something mystical, a connection of soul and spirit. When a rider dies, the dragon feels it. When a dragon falls, the rider is shattered. In the dance, these bonds were tested to the point of breaking. We will see dragons refusing to fight, and dragons fighting with a ferocity that suggests they understood the stakes better than the humans on their backs. From the stormy cliffs of Storm's End to the muddy banks of the God's Eye, the geography of Westeros became a character in itself. The land absorbed the blood of the fallen, and the rivers ran red with the ambition of kings. We will trace the movements of the armies, the strategic blunders that cost thousands of lives, and the moments of unexpected brilliance that turned the tide of battle. We will see how the naval power of House Velaryon held the realm in a stranglehold, and how the gold of Casterly Rock fueled the fires of the Green Cause. This is a story about the end of magic, but it is also a story about the endurance of the human spirit. Even in the darkest moments of the war, there were acts of courage and sacrifice. There were those who stayed true to their oaths when it would have been easier to betray them. There were those who sought to protect the innocent when the world was falling apart. These small flickers of light only served to make the surrounding darkness feel even deeper. As we transition into the main narrative, let your mind wander to the Great Hall of the Red Keep. See the flickering torches reflecting off the polished stone. Hear the distant roar of a dragon echoing from the pits below. Feel the weight of history pressing down on you. This is not just a tale from a book. For the people of Westeros, it was a living nightmare. And for us, it is a window into the darkest corners of the human heart. The Dance of the Dragons is more than just a sequence of events. It is a tapestry of ambition, heartbreak, and the inevitable consequences of power. It is the dark truth that even the most powerful among us are vulnerable to the simplest of human failings: jealousy, spite, and the fear of being forgotten. These are the things that truly fueled the Dragonfire. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back to the year 129, to the bedside of a dying king and the birth of a war that would change the world. The dragons are waiting, the dance is about to begin, and the truth, as always, is buried in the ashes. Before we move into the chronological breakdown of the war, I want to emphasize the sheer scale of what was lost. We often think of the Targaryen dynasty as it was in the time of Robert Baratheon, a fallen house with only a few exiled children remaining. But in the days before the dance, they were an empire. They had the wealth of the world, the strongest military force ever assembled, and a monopoly on the most powerful creatures to ever exist. To lose all of that in just 2 short years of fighting is almost incomprehensible. It is a collapse of such magnitude that it serves as a permanent scar on the history of the world. We will also look at the aftermath. The war didn't just end when the last king died. It left a legacy of trauma that lasted for generations. The broken king, Aegon III, would spend his entire life haunted by what he saw as a child. The lords of Westeros would never again trust the Targaryens in the same way. The mystical aura of the Dragon Riders was gone, replaced by the cold reality of political maneuvering and the slow decay of a family that had lost its fire. As we explore the dark truth, we will also touch upon the theories and mysteries that still surround this period. Was there a conspiracy by the maesters of the Citadel to rid the world of dragons? Did the Valyrian magic fail because of the kinslaying, or was it something more systemic? We will look at the evidence and the lore, searching for the answers that have been hidden for centuries. The story of the dance is a long one, and it is a heavy one, but it is also a story of incredible beauty and wonder. Even in the midst of the horror, there is the majesty of the dragons in flight, the nobility of the ancient houses, and the sheer epic scale of a world at war with itself. It is a story that deserves to be told with care, with respect for the tragedy, and with an eye for the small details that make the history come alive. So, as the night grows deeper and the world around you becomes quiet, let the story of the greens and the blacks wash over you. Let the names of the dragons and the kings become a rhythm that carries you away. We are going deep into the heart of Westeros, to a time of fire and blood, to uncover the truth that lies beneath the legend. This is the Dance of the Dragons. This is the dark truth of House Targaryen. And this is the journey we are taking tonight. We will start by looking at the reign of Viserys I, the calm before the storm. We will see how the decisions he made, and the ones he failed to make, created the perfect conditions for a civil war. We will meet the young Rhaenyra and the ambitious Alicent, and see how their friendship turned into a rivalry that would consume them both. We will see the birth of the factions and the first whispers of treason. Then, we will move to the death of the king and the immediate chaos of the coup. We will see the secret meetings of the small council, the coronation of Aegon II, and the moment Rhaenyra learned that her throne had been taken. We will witness the first act of violence at Storm's End, the spark that turned a political dispute into a total war. From there, we will follow the war as it spreads across the continent. We will see the battles in the Riverlands, the naval engagements in the Gullet, and the dragon duels over the Reach. We will see the fall of King's Landing, the flight of the queens, and the desperate struggle for survival as the dragons began to die out. Finally, we will look at the end of the war and the long, cold winter that followed. We will see the crowning of the new king and the efforts to rebuild a shattered realm. We will reflect on what was lost and what remained, and the lasting impact of the dance on the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. It is a long road ahead, but there is no need to rush. We have all the time in the world. The fire is burning low, the dragons are circling in the distance, and the story is waiting to be told. Let's begin. The history of Westeros is written in blood, but no chapter is as red as the one we are about to open. The Dance of the Dragons is a reminder that the higher you fly, the harder you fall. And House Targaryen flew higher than anyone. They touched the sun, and in doing so, they ensured that their eventual fall would be spectacular, terrifying, and absolute. As we move into the first chapter of this dark history, remember that the truth is often more complicated than the songs make it out to be. There were no clear villains, only people driven by their own fears and desires. There were no easy answers, only difficult choices, with devastating consequences. And there was no way to stop the fire once it had been lit. The stage is set, the actors are ready. The first notes of the dance are playing in the distance. Let us step back in time, to a world of dragons and kings, and uncover the dark truth together. The reign of Viserys I was a golden age. Every maester will tell you that. The Seven Kingdoms were at peace, trade flourished, and the Iron Throne sat in King's Landing as a symbol of stability that had not been seen since Aegon the Conqueror himself. Dragons flew above the Red Keep, their shadows dancing over cobblestones and courtiers alike, and the Targaryen name carried an aura of invincibility that seemed eternal. But every golden age casts a shadow, and in that shadow, something dark was already stirring. Viserys I inherited a throne that had been smoothed by decades of careful rule, yet the throne itself was forged from swords, and swords have edges. To understand the Dance of the Dragons, you must first understand the hidden rot that lay beneath the gilded surface of Viserys's reign. A rot that began not with a battle, but with a council. The Great Council of 101 years after the conquest was meant to settle a succession crisis. King Jaehaerys I, the old king, had outlived his sons, and the lords of Westeros were summoned to Harrenhal to decide who would follow him. The two main claimants were Viserys, a man, and his cousin Rhaenys, a woman. The council chose Viserys, and in doing so, they set a precedent that would echo through the generations, that the Iron Throne should pass to a male heir, even when a female claimant might be more directly descended. That decision was not a law, it was a choice, but it became a tradition that the Greens would later wield like a blade. And Viserys, who benefited from that tradition, did nothing to dismantle it. He ruled peacefully, yes, but he ruled on a foundation that had already begun to crack. The lords who had sworn to uphold the male line were the same lords who would later turn on his daughter, and the dragons, oh, the dragons. They were the true source of Targaryen power, and under Viserys, their numbers swelled to nearly 20. Vhagar, the last of the original conquest dragons, still flew. Caraxes, the bloodworm, ranged across the narrow sea. Syrax, golden and proud, rested in the Dragonpit. With so many dragons, the Targaryens felt invincible, untouchable. But dragons are not loyal to thrones, they are loyal to riders. And every rider carries their own ambition, their own ego. The abundance of dragons created a false sense of security, a belief that no enemy could challenge the House of the Dragon. Yet the greatest enemy was already within the walls of the Red Keep: family pride, jealousy, and the silent war between the Queen and the Princess. Viserys loved his daughter Rhaenyra, and he named her his heir, forcing every lord in the realm to swear allegiance. But he also remarried, to Alicent Hightower, and fathered sons. And as those sons grew, so did the whispers. The Great Council had chosen a man over a woman once. Why not again? The peace that Viserys built was a fragile tapestry, and the threads were already fraying. The rot was not in the throne room, not yet. It was in the quiet conversations between Alicent and her father, Otto Hightower. It was in the sidelong glances of the Kingsguard. It was in the way the small council meetings grew tense, the way words like tradition and law became weapons, and it was in the dragons themselves, lounging in the sun, unaware that they would soon be turned against their own kin. The golden age of Viserys I was a beautiful lie, a mask of prosperity and stability that concealed a kingdom on the brink of tearing itself apart. The first crack in that mask appeared the moment Viserys drew his last breath, but the fracture lines had been forming for decades, and that brings us to the heir he left behind, a daughter named Rhaenyra, who believed with all her heart that the throne was hers. Her story, and the story of those who sought to steal that throne, is where the shadow deepens into something far darker. That story begins with the Heir Apparent, a woman who carried the blood of the dragon, but who would soon learn that blood alone is never enough to hold the Iron Throne. The golden sheen of Viserys I's reign, that deceptive peak of Targaryen prosperity, masked a fault line buried deep in the bedrock of the Iron Throne. The Great Council of 101 AC had sealed a precedent: male preference inheritance, a son before a daughter, a brother before an aunt. That decision had denied Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, her birthright, and it had chosen Viserys himself. But kings are not bound by councils forever, and Viserys, a man who loved his daughter more than he feared tradition, was about to shatter the very foundation he stood upon. When Queen Arryn died in childbirth, the realm mourned, and Viserys lost not only his wife, but the hope of a male heir from her line. The only child who survived was Rhaenyra, fierce, bright, and her father's mirror. She was 7 when her mother perished, and Viserys looked upon her and saw the future. He made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He named her his heir, not a council of lords, not a traditional claim based on age or gender, his word, his will. And he demanded that every lord in the 7 kingdoms swear a sacred oath to uphold her succession. Think of the weight of that moment. In the great hall of the Red Keep, beneath the painted table and the skulls of dragons long dead, lord after lord knelt before the princess. They placed their hands on the Iron Throne's sharp edges and swore by the old gods and the new. Lord Stark of Winterfell, Lord Arryn of the Eyrie, Lord Lannister, Lord Tyrell, Lord Baratheon. Their vows were not empty. They were binding, woven into the fabric of feudal loyalty. A lord's word was his bond, and to break such an oath was to invite divine wrath and temporal ruin. Viserys believed he had secured Rhaenyra's future. He believed the lords would remember, but the lords remembered the Great Council too. And in the shadows of the court, another family began to weave a different tapestry. Alicent Hightower, King's second wife, had given him sons. First Aegon, then Aemond, then Daeron, and with each birth, the Hightower influence grew. Otto Hightower, the hand of the king, whispered of stability, of tradition, of the realm's need for a king who was a man grown. He did not directly challenge Rhaenyra, not yet. Instead, he cultivated loyalty among the court, among the maesters, among those who believed that a woman could not hold the Iron Throne against the storm that would come. Rhaenyra felt the shift. She was not blind to the sidelong glances, the hushed conversations that fell silent when she entered a room. The friendship she had once shared with Alicent, her father's young queen, curdled into a cold war of smiles and barbed courtesies. Ostensibly, Alicent supported Rhaenyra as heir, but her eyes lingered on her son Aegon's golden hair, on the small crown she placed on his head during private games. The seeds of the dance were sown, not in a single betrayal, but in 1,000 small acts of division, and yet for a time the oaths held. Viserys remained alive, ailing but still the king. Rhaenyra married Lyonor Velaryon, strengthening the Black Alliance with the sea power of Driftmark. She bore children, though rumours of their true parentage would later be used as weapons against her. She learned to rule Dragonstone, to manage a household of dragons and their riders. She was no passive princess. She trained, she studied, she mastered the ancient tongue of Valyria. She was ready. But the weight of those sworn oaths was already cracking under the pressure of ambition. The Hightowers did not move openly. They moved in the spaces between words, in the small hours of the night, in the private councils of the king's small chamber. They tightened their grip on the treasury, on the Kingsguard, on the very heir of the Red Keep. And when Viserys finally succumbed to his illness, weak and exhausted by a reign of careful balance, they struck. The Lord's oaths were about to be tested by fire and blood, and in that trial, the realm would learn that no promise is sacred when a crown is at stake. The early friction between Rhaenyra and the Hightower family was not yet war. It was a slow poison, dripped into the ears of those who had once knelt and sworn. And when the poison took hold, it would give rise to a second queen, one who claimed the throne not by birth but by marriage, not by the king's word but by her own unyielding will. Her name was Alicent, and her story is the next shadow that falls across this tale. The air in the Red Keep had never felt quite so heavy as it did in the months following the Great Council's oaths. The Lords of the Seven Kingdoms had sworn on their honour, on their swords, on the bones of their ancestors, to accept Rhaenyra Targaryen as queen after Viserys. The words were sealed with solemnity, the parchment still warm from the royal seal. But oaths, as history teaches us, are only as strong as the fear that enforces them. And in the quiet corridors of the castle, a different kind of power was beginning to stir. Subtle, patient, and draped in Hightower green. Viserys had chosen Rhaenyra, yes, but he had also chosen a second queen for himself. And that choice would unravel everything. Alicent Hightower, the daughter of the Hand of the King, had been a fixture of the court since her childhood. A companion to the princess, a whisper in the shadows of power. After Queen Aemma's death, Viserys was a man adrift, grieving and desperate for a male heir. Otto Hightower, ever the architect of influence, saw his opportunity. He did not push his daughter forward with a crude demand. He suggested, with the careful precision of a maester threading a wound, that the king might find solace in the daughter of his most trusted advisor, a marriage of comfort, of duty, of statecraft, and so the wedding was arranged. Alicent Hightower, barely into her womanhood, became Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. She moved from the Maidenvool to the royal bedchamber, her soft gowns traded for silks of green and gold. The wedding was modest by Targaryen standards. No great tourney, no dragon processions, but it was a wedding nonetheless, and with it came a quiet shift in the architecture of power. The king's small council, once a body that balanced the competing interests of the great houses, began to tilt. Otto Hightower was not just the hand now, he was the queen's father, and the queen's voice, once confined to the women's quarters, now had a seat at the table of kings. Within a year, Alicent bore Viserys a son. The child was named Aegon, a name heavy with the weight of prophecy and conquest. The bells of the Great Sept rang for a full day, and the streets of King's Landing filled with celebrants who had not cheered for Rhaenyra's birth. But these were not just any cries of joy. They were the cries of a kingdom that had, in its heart, always wanted a king. The birth of Aegon II, even as a babe in swaddling, was a living challenge to the oath the lords had sworn. He was proof that the old traditions could not be undone by a single monarch's decree. And as the boy grew, first a toddler clutching his mother's skirts, then a young prince learning to walk the halls of the Red Keep, a faction began to form around him, not openly, not with banners and declarations, but in the quiet meetings between Otto Hightower and the Master of Coin, in the whispered reassurances between Alicent and the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, in the way the court began to divide its loyalties, not by law but by blood. They called themselves the Greens, for the sigil of House Hightower, and they saw in Aegon the true heir, not by any written will, but by the ancient principle of male preference, the same principle that had, generations before, seated Viserys himself on the throne instead of Rhaenys, the queen who never was. Rhaenyra felt the change before she could name it. The small council meeting she had once attended with confidence now carried a new weight. The eyes of lords who had sworn to her flickered toward the nursery where Aegon slept. The warmth of courtiers grew thin, replaced by polite distance. She was still the heir, still called Princess of Dragonstone, but the title now sounded like a reminder of what might be taken away. The psychological toll was slow, like water eroding stone. She began to see the careful glances, the turned backs, the way her father's health faltered, and with it the strength of his word. She doubled her training on Dragonback, flying Cyrax through storms as if to outrun the doubt. But the doubt was not in the sky. It was in the soil of King's Landing, watered every day by the presence of the second queen and her sons. Alicent Hightower, once Rhaenyra's closest friend, became something else entirely. The girl who shared her secrets now shared the king's bed and his council. Their conversations grew formal, the silences between them long and cold. When Alicent looked at Rhaenyra, she did not see a princess. She saw a threat to her children, and when Rhaenyra looked at Alicent, she saw the mother of a rival. A woman whose ambition was hidden behind 7-pointed stars and measured words. The friendship that had once been the heart of the court became the first casualty of the coming war. As the years passed, the Greens grew bolder. Otto Hightower argued in council that the succession must be clarified, that the realm needed stability, that a woman's claim could never be as firm as a man's. He spoke of precedent, of the Great Council of 101 AC that had chosen Viserys over Rhaenys. He did not mention that his own daughter was the mother of the male heir, but he did not need to. Every lord in the room understood, and so the seeds of betrayal were sown. Not in a single act of treason, but in 1,000 small concessions, 1,000 whispered doubts, 1,000 moments where the oaths of the lords became parchment without teeth. By the time Viserys I lay on his deathbed, the stage was set. The king's will had named Rhaenyra, but the king's court had already chosen another, and when the news of his death came, swift and secret, the Greens would act. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, the slow drift toward disaster was almost complete. The house that must remain united was already fractured, and the cracks ran deep beneath the floor of the throne room. What happened next, when the dying king's word was ignored and a usurper wore the crown, would split the realm in two. That is the truth of the next chapter. A house divided by ambition, tradition, and the ashes of a broken oath. The seeds of division had been sown, but in the year 111 after the conquest, they burst into full poisonous bloom. The court of King Viserys should have been a place of unity, a symbol of Targaryen strength. Yet, beneath the gilded surface, the cracks were already spreading like veins in crumbling stone. Alicent Hightower had given the king a son, and with him a new axis of power. The old alliances bent, the new ones hardened, and the king himself, ever the peacemaker, seemed blind to the war brewing in his own hall. It was at the great tourney of 111 that the colours of this coming conflict were first worn as badges of allegiance. The king, in a gesture meant to honour both his daughter and his wife, decreed that the knights of the realm would compete in a grand melee and joust. But the symbolism of the day was not lost on the sharp-eyed. The queen, Alicent, appeared in a gown of deep green, the colour of the Hightower's beacon, a silent statement of her house's rising prominence. And Princess Rhaenyra, the heir to the Iron Throne, chose to ride in the procession dressed in the black of House Targaryen, the dragon's own hue. No one spoke it aloud, but from that day forward, the realm would whisper of greens and blacks. What began as a choice of fabric became the banner of two irreconcilable futures. The tourney itself was a spectacle of blood and glory. Knights from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms came to prove their mettle, and among them, one figure rose above all others, a man who would come to embody the very fracture of the court. Sir Criston Cole, the son of a steward from the Dornish marches, had already earned a reputation as a fierce and honourable warrior. He had been Rhaenyra's champion, her protector, the man who commanded her Kingsguard. But the tourney of 111 would be the stage for a transformation that would echo through the ages. The jousting lists were packed. The crowd roared as lance shattered against shield, and in the final tilt, Sir Criston Cole faced off against one of Rhaenyra's closest allies, a Velaryon knight. The duel was brutal, the horses thundering, the crowd on its feet. In the end, Criston Cole unhorsed his opponent, but the victory came at a cost. As he removed his helm, his eyes met the Queen's box. Alicent Hightower smiled, a smile that was not merely polite, but calculated. And in that moment, something shifted in Ser Criston's heart. Historians have debated what turned him. Was it the Queen's flattery, the bitter memory of a rejected love, or simply the realization that the future of the realm would not belong to a woman, no matter how beloved? But the truth is simpler and darker. Criston Cole saw the rift, and he chose a side. He abandoned the princess, whose life he had sworn to protect. He pledged his sword to the Queen and her son. From protector to bitter enemy, the turn was complete. He became the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard for the Greens, and his skill at arms would later make him the architect of some of the war's most brutal campaigns. Meanwhile, the rivalry between Rhaenyra and Alicent deepened. What had once been a friendship of sorts, two young women navigating the treacherous currents of court, became a cold war. Every glance was a calculation, every word a dagger wrapped in velvet. Alicent saw Rhaenyra as a threat to her children, a woman whose claim overshadowed the rightful heir. Rhaenyra saw Alicent as a usurper, a schemer who had stolen her father's heart and now aimed to steal her throne. They circled each other like dragons over a carcass, each waiting for the other to strike first. The fracture mirrored the kingdom's growing divide. Lords who had sworn oaths to Rhaenyra whispered behind closed doors, wondering if a woman could truly hold the realm together. Others, loyal to tradition, rallied to the Queen's cause. The great houses began to choose, but they did so in secret, sending ravens and spies, testing the winds. King's Landing became a nest of vipers. The Red Keep, once a symbol of Targaryen unity, now echoed with the sound of two queens, one crowned by law, the other by the king's own word, each believing the future belonged to them. And all the while, King Viserys sat on the Iron Throne, his body rotting, his mind clouded by grief and illness. He saw the colours, heard the whispers, but he refused to act. He believed that his will alone could hold the line. He was wrong. The tourney of 111 was not just a celebration of martial prowess. It was the day the mask slipped. After that, there was no going back. The seeds of the Dance of the Dragons were already germinating in the soil of resentment. But before the first blood was spilled, before the dragons themselves would clash in the sky, another figure would emerge from the shadows to tip the balance. A rogue prince whose fire could not be contained. His name was Daemon Targaryen, and his story is the subject of our next chapter. The tourney of 111 AC had ended, but its colours lingered like a wound that would not heal. Green and black now marked every corner of the Red Keep, and the court divided not only by allegiance but by blood. In the years that followed, the rift between Rhaenyra and Alicent deepened into something colder than rivalry. It became a quiet war, fought with glances, whispers, and carefully placed words. And at the centre of this storm, like a dragon too restless for any cage, stood Prince Daemon Targaryen. Daemon had always been the rogue, the second son who thrived on chaos and blood. His volatile influence was a constant tension in Viserys' court. He was the king's own brother, yet he treated the throne as though it were a toy to be broken. After his banishment following the tourney, or rather, after he was sent away for his provocations, Daemon did not slink into obscurity. He did not fade like a disappointed lord. Instead, he gathered a small army of sellswords and lesser lords who shared his hunger for glory, and he turned his gaze to the Stepstones. The Stepstones were a chain of barren islands between Westeros and Essos, a haven for pirates who preyed on the shipping lanes of the narrow sea. For years, the Triarchy, a loose alliance of free cities, had used these islands as a base for their raids. But Daemon saw opportunity where others saw only salt and rock. He saw a battlefield where he could carve out a kingdom of his own, a realm where he would not be the spare but the sovereign, and so he launched a war, a brutal campaign known as the Conquest of the Stepstones. It was not a war sanctioned by the Iron Throne, but Daemon did not ask for permission. He took what he wanted as he always did. The campaign was ferocious. Daemon rode Caraxes, the Bloodworm, a dragon as fierce and unpredictable as its rider. Together they burned fleets, torched pirate dens, and sent the Triarchy reeling. The local lords who opposed him were crushed. Those who bent the knee were allowed to live. In less than a year, Daemon declared himself King of the Narrow Sea. He styled himself as the Lord of the Stepstones, and for a brief, glorious moment, he had a crown of his own. A simple band of copper and jade, but a crown nonetheless. It was a threat and a promise, a signal to his brother that he would not be contained. Yet even as Daemon carved his legend into the rocks of the Stepstones, a far more delicate maneuver was unfolding in King's Landing. Viserys, increasingly frail and desperate to secure his daughter's claim, turned to the one family whose power could tip the scales of succession. House Velaryon, Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, commanded the greatest fleet in the Seven Kingdoms. His wife, Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, was the queen who never was, passed over by the Great Council of 101. Together, they held the keys to the Narrow Sea, and Viserys needed those keys. The strategic marriage between Rhaenyra and Lyonor Velaryon was announced with great fanfare. It was a union designed to unite the blood of the dragons with the iron of the seas. Lyonor was Rhaenys' son, a dragon rider himself, and the heir to Driftmark. The marriage would bind House Velaryon irrevocably to Rhaenyra's cause, providing the naval power that could counter any green-backed fleet. It was a masterstroke of politics, but it was not a marriage born of love. Rhaenyra had little affection for Lyonor, and Lyonor's own preferences were well known. He had no interest in women. Their union was a contract, a treaty sealed in a sept, and both parties understood the cost. The wedding itself was a grand affair, a display of Targaryen opulence, but beneath the silk and the dragonfire, whispers began to stir. Rhaenyra's firstborn, Jacaerys, came into the world within a year of the marriage. He had brown hair, a plain face, and features that bore no resemblance to Lyonor's silver-gold locks. The boy looked nothing like a Velaryon, and when the second son, Lucerys, was born with dark hair and a sturdy build, the whispers grew louder. The children, it was said, were not Lyonor's. They were the sons of Sir Harwin Strong, the commander of the City Watch, and a man of common appearance. Harwin was a loyal friend to Rhaenyra, but his loyalty became a weapon in the hands of her enemies. The rumours of bastardy were not merely gossip. They were a calculated assault on Rhaenyra's legitimacy. The weaponization of the word strong became the Green's most insidious tool. Alicent and her father, Otto Hightower, saw the ambiguity of the children's parentage as a crack in Rhaenyra's armour. If the heir to the Iron Throne was not of Targaryen blood, if her sons were bastards, then the lords of Westeros could be made to question their oaths. The whispers spread like wildfire through every hall and tavern, and with each telling, the truth mattered less than the accusation. Daemon, meanwhile, watched from his distant throne in the Stepstones. He had not attended the wedding. He had no love for Lyonor, and he saw the marriage as a leash. But when the rumours reached him, he saw an opportunity. He returned to King's Landing, not as a supplicant, but as a king. He offered Rhaenyra something Lyonor could never give her: legitimacy through blood. He was a Targaryen, a dragon rider, a warrior. He could sire true-born heirs, and he wanted her. The court was thrown into chaos. Daemon's presence reignited old tensions. Viserys refused to annul the marriage, but he could not control his brother. The rogue prince and the heir princess began a dangerous dance, one that would lead to the death of Lyonor Velaryon under suspicious circumstances. A fight in a brothel, a fire, a body burned beyond recognition. Convenient. And then, within a year, Daemon and Rhaenyra were married in a secret ceremony on Dragonstone. The realm whispered of murder, but no one dared speak it aloud. The marriage between Rhaenyra and Daemon was a union of fire and chaos. It strengthened her claim within the Black faction, but it also cemented the Green's hatred. The children of Rhaenyra's first marriage, Jaehaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey, were now stepchildren to a man who had no patience for weakness, and the new children born of Daemon's blood, Aegon the Younger, Viserys, were seen as the true heirs. The realm was now divided not only by colour, but by the very definition of lineage. The weaponization of bastardy had found its target, and the cracks in the foundation of the Seven Kingdoms widened into chasms. Yet all of this simmered beneath the surface of Viserys' final, fragile years. The king grew weaker, his body ravaged by a wasting disease that left him a skeleton in silk. He clung to the throne, refusing to name a regent, refusing to see the storm that was brewing. He held court from a wheeled chair, his mask of gold hiding the decay beneath. And as he faded, the two factions gathered their dragons and their army, waiting for the moment when the king's final breath would be drawn. That moment is coming, and when it comes, the fire will be unleashed. But before we reach that fatal hour, we must understand the forces that will be unleashed. The next chapter, The King's Final Breath, will reveal how a dying man's silence doomed his realm to a war that would consume everything he loved. Stay with me, for the candles are burning low, and the shadows are growing long. The truth is darker than any dragon's flame. The victory in the Stepstones brought Daemon Targaryen back to court with a conqueror's swagger, but the peace he returned to was a mirage. For while the rogue prince had been carving his legend abroad, the true battle for the Iron Throne had already begun, not with steel and fire, but with sickness and silence. By the time Daemon's fleet docked at King's Landing, King Viserys I was no longer the man who had once commanded the great lords of Westeros to swear fealty to his daughter. He was a walking skeleton, a king who had been slowly consumed by a disease that rotted him from within. The leeches could not save him, nor the prayers of the maesters. His body, once robust, had become a cage of open sores and brittle bones. He could no longer walk the length of the throne room without leaning on a servant, and when he spoke, his voice was a rasp that carried only a few feet before dissolving into the cold air of the Red Keep. And yet the small council kept him on the throne, not out of loyalty, but out of convenience. For as long as Viserys drew breath, even a breath so shallow and laboured, the succession remained a matter of royal decree. The moment he died, his will would be challenged, his authority would vanish, and the oaths sworn to Rhaenyra would become nothing more than words on parchment. So the king lingered. He lingered through fevers and fainting spells, through nights of screaming that no one acknowledged, through days where he mistook his own wife for a servant. The Red Keep became a mausoleum before its master had even died. Curtains were drawn tight, meals were taken in silence, and the maesters came and went with grim faces that told the court nothing and everything. It was in this twilight that the Hightowers began to lay their trap. Otto Hightower, the hand of the king, had long since learned to read the subtle language of power. He knew the king would not see another winter, and so, in secret, he began to coordinate with his daughter, Queen Alicent, and with the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Criston Cole. They did not speak openly of treason. That would have been foolish. But every whisper, every nod, every carefully worded letter carried the same message. Prepare. They stockpiled gold in the treasury. They sent riders to Old Town, to Casterly Rock, to every lord who might be persuaded to support a male heir over a female one. They made quiet arrangements with the City Watch, ensuring that the gates of King's Landing would be closed at a moment's notice, and they prepared the coronation regalia for the one they intended to place on the throne, Aegon II, Viserys' eldest son. But all of this had to be done in absolute secrecy. The Black still commanded considerable loyalty, and Rhaenyra had spies of her own. Any hint of conspiracy, any slip of a tongue, could trigger a civil war before the king had even drawn his last breath. So the Hightowers waited, and the king continued to die. It is difficult to describe the peculiar horror of watching a king rot, while pretending everything is fine. Courtiers smiled and bowed as Viserys was carried past in a litter. Minstrels played in the great hall, as if nothing were wrong, and little Aegon, barely a man, was kept away from his father's bedchamber, shielded from the truth that he might soon become a king. The Red Keep was a theatre, and every actor knew their role, but the performance could not last forever. One autumn night, as the rain beat against the windows of the king's tower, Viserys I finally let go. It was not a dramatic death. There was no final speech, no grand gesture. He simply stopped breathing. The maester recorded the time, closed the king's eyes, and walked silently into the corridor, and then silence. For the first hour, only a handful of people knew the king was dead. Queen Alicent was informed first, and she did not weep. She simply nodded, gave a few quiet orders, and returned to her chambers to change into a gown of green. Otto Hightower was the second to know. He immediately sealed the king's chambers and sent word to the commander of the city watch. Lock the gates. No one leaves the city. No ravens fly. The body of Viserys was washed and dressed in silence. No bells were rung. No official announcement was made. The small council convened in the dead of night, and by dawn, the capital had become a cage. The people of King's Landing went about their business, unaware that their king had passed, that the throne they served was already being contested, that the first drop of blood had already fallen, that the chill of that silence was felt by those who knew. Rhaenyra, far away on Dragonstone, received no raven that night. Her spies would take days to bring the news, and by then, the Greens would have already crowned their king. The power vacuum in the Red Keep had been filled, not by the rightful heir, but by those who had planned this moment for years. The king's final breath had not ended the succession crisis. It had only lit the fuse, and the explosion would come not with a roar, but with the quiet click of a crown being set upon a usurper's head. What happened next, in that secret council chamber, would change the course of history. It is a story of oaths broken, of daggers drawn in the dark, and of a kingdom that chose tradition over truth. That story is called the Green Council, and it began the moment the king fell silent. The king's final breath had barely left his lips when the conspirators set their plan into motion. Viserys I, the man who had ruled the Seven Kingdoms for over a quarter of a century, died alone in his bed, his rotting body finally giving out after years of agony. But the news of his death did not travel through the Red Keep as a solemn proclamation. Instead, it was smothered, held like a secret dagger beneath the cloak of the night. The hour was late, far past midnight, when the members of the small council gathered in the Tower of the Hand. The corridor outside the chamber was silent, save for the soft tread of guards who had been carefully selected for their loyalty to the Hightowers. No one else would be allowed near. Inside, the air was thick with tension, heavy as the velvet curtains that muffled every sound. Around the table sat the architects of the coup: Queen Alicent Hightower, her father Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, Ser Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and the Master of Coin, Lord Lyman Beesbury. Others were there too: Grand Maester Orwyle, Lord Jasper Wild, and the Master of Laws. But it was the presence of Lord Beesbury that would prove most troublesome. Otto Hightower opened the proceedings with a calm that belied the urgency of the moment. He spoke of the need for stability, for continuity, for the realm to have a strong king. He mentioned Aegon, the king's eldest son, as if the matter were already settled, and then he produced the crown. Viserys' own crown, taken from the royal chambers as soon as the king had breathed his last. The plan was simple: crown Aegon II before dawn, present the lords of Westeros with a fait accompli, and ensure that Rhaenyra never had a chance to press her claim. But Lord Lyman Beesbury was not a man who could be swayed by convenience. He was old, nearing 80, and had served as Master of Coin under 4 kings. He had been present when Viserys named Rhaenyra his heir, had witnessed the oaths sworn by every lord in the realm, and he remembered them. When Otto finished speaking, Beesbury rose from his seat, his voice trembling with indignation. He reminded the council that they were breaking the sacred law of the king, that they were violating the explicit will of Viserys I, and that such an act would plunge the Seven Kingdoms into war. He called them traitors, every one of them. Alicent tried to reason with him, explaining that tradition demanded a son over a daughter, that the realm would never accept a ruling queen, but Beesbury would not yield. He argued that a king's word was law, that the lords had sworn to uphold Rhaenyra's succession, and that to ignore that oath was to destroy the very foundation of their society. The ideological clash was laid bare, the ancient traditions of Andal law, which placed a son before a daughter, versus the absolute decree of the monarch, which Viserys had made crystal clear. And here, in this midnight meeting where the small council conspired to ignore the king's explicit will, the two principles could not coexist. Sir Criston Cole lost his patience. He had always been a man of action, not words. He drew his sword, and in one swift motion, he struck Lord Beesbury across the head. The old man fell, his skull splitting against the stone floor. The first blood of the war had been spilled, not on a battlefield, not in a tourney, but in a closed chamber, by a Kingsguard sworn to protect the royal family, and it was spilled in the name of Aegon II. Before Aegon himself had even been told of his father's death, the other council members stared in shock. Some were complicit, some were horrified, but none dared speak against the murder. Grand Maester Orwyle quietly noted that Lord Beesbury had been lost in a tragic accident. The story would be spread that he had fallen from his horse, or perhaps tripped in the dark. The truth was buried with his body, disposed of before the sun could rise. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The Greens had drawn first blood, and they would not stop until the Iron Throne was secured. The chamber fell into a grim silence. Otto Hightower ordered the servants to bring wine, as if to wash away the stain of what had just happened. Plans were made for the coronation at dawn. Messengers were prepared to ride to the lords who could be trusted, the Lannisters, the Baratheons, the Tyrells, and a raven was sent to Dragonstone, carrying a letter full of lies, offering terms to Rhaenyra, pretending that the succession was still in question. But the die was cast, and yet, for all their careful planning, the Greens had not accounted for one thing. The will of the king had been witnessed by more than just a handful of lords. There were still those who remembered the oaths, who respected the law, who would not accept a usurper. The crown that Otto held in his hands would never sit easily on Aegon's head. For every lord who bent the knee at the coronation, there would be another who sharpened a sword in the shadows. When the morning came, the city of King's Landing woke to the ringing of bells. The small folk gathered in the streets, confused, as they watched the royal procession make its way to the Dragonpit. There, before the great dragon skulls and the silent masses, Aegon II was crowned. He looked pale, uncertain, a reluctant king pushed onto a throne he had never truly wanted. His mother Alicent placed the crown upon his head. The crowd cheered, because they were told to cheer, because they feared what would happen if they did not. But far away, across the Blackwater Bay, the news would soon reach a woman who had spent her entire life expecting to rule. She would hear of her father's death and her brother's coronation in the same breath, and she would know that the only path left to her was war. This was not the end of the dance. It was only the beginning, and the crown that sat on Aegon's head would soon be known by a darker name, a name that would echo through the ages, whispered in the same breath as betrayal, the usurper's crown. But that story, and the bloody consequences that followed, belonged to the next chapter. The hour was still dark when the first blood of this war was spilled. Lord Lyman Beesbury, a man who had served the Iron Throne faithfully for decades, his life ended by a throne in the council chamber. The act, as much as the conspiracy it sealed, marked the point of no return. The Greens had made their choice. Now they had to move quickly, before the realm had a chance to breathe. Before word could slip through the cracks and reach the heir they had just betrayed, King Viserys' body still lay in his chambers, not yet cold, and already his will was being twisted beyond recognition. The funeral could wait. The mourning could wait. What could not wait was the coronation of Aegon II. For a usurper to hold the throne, he must not appear to have seized it. He must appear chosen. He must appear anointed. And so the Green Council, barely hours after the king's death, set in motion a ceremony that would be remembered not for its majesty, but for its indecent haste. They chose the Dragonpit, not the great Sept of Baelor, not the Red Keep's throne room. The Dragonpit, the massive stone dome that had housed the Targaryen dragons for generations. It was a deliberate statement. They wanted the image of Aegon, crowned before the very beasts that had made his family rulers of Westeros. But they also understood the risk. A coronation in the Dragonpit could be seen as an insult to the faith, especially when the High Septon himself had not been consulted. Still, the Greens had no time to secure the blessing of the faith. They needed a crown on Aegon's head before the sun set. The lockdown of King's Landing was total. Every gate was sealed. The harbour was watched. No raven could fly without being intercepted by guards loyal to Queen Alicent. The city became a cage, and inside that cage, the court was herded toward the Dragonpit, like sheep to the slaughter. Except the slaughter was a coronation. Lords and ladies were summoned at sword point. Some came willingly, eager to curry favour with the new regime. Others came because the alternative was a cell beneath the Red Keep, or worse. The Dragonpit itself had been hastily decorated. Banners of the golden three-headed dragon on black hung from the walls. The great iron doors groaned open, and the crowd that had been gathered, mostly small folk, who had no idea they were witnessing a coup, filled the lower ears. Above them, on a makeshift dais in the centre of the arena, stood the throne that Lord Beesbury had died to defend. But it was not the Iron Throne. No, the Greens did not dare drag that monstrous seat of swords out of the throne room. Instead, they had placed a wooden chair, gilded and draped in crimson, under the open sky where the dragons once roosted. Aegon II entered the pit, wearing a cloak of gold and black, his silver hair tangled, his eyes still puffy from a night of wine and fear. He had not wanted this. He had told his mother as much in the hours before dawn. But Alicent Hightower had not raised a son who could refuse her. So he walked, steps heavy, up to that wooden throne, and he knelt. The crown they placed upon his head was not his father's. King Viserys' crown, the one Rhaenyra had been promised, was still in the royal vaults. The Greens had prepared a different circlet, a simple band of gold set with rubies and black diamonds. It was said to be the crown of King Jaehaerys I, the old king, the one who had unified the realm and ruled for over 50 years. It was a crown of legitimacy, a symbol meant to say, but it was also a crown that had not been worn in decades, and it felt wrong on Aegon's brow. The Septon who performed the ceremony spoke the ancient words in High Valyrian, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The crowd watched in silence. Some wept. Some cheered, mostly the men who had conspired, their clapping sharp and forced. And when the crown was settled, when the last prayer was uttered, a roar went up from the Green supporters. It was a hollow roar, a sound that could not mask the absence of the dragons, who once filled this very pit with living fire. And yet, as Aegon rose and turned to face his new subjects, there was a moment, brief, terrible, when even his own mother must have felt the lie. The throne was not the Iron Throne. The crown was not Viserys' crown. The king was not the chosen heir. And somewhere in the city, a man was already moving against them. Sir Steffon Darklyn was not a man anyone expected to be a hero. He was the commander of the City Watch, the Gold Cloaks, but he was also a knight sworn to the King's Guard, or he had been until the coup. When the Greens sealed the gates, they had assumed all the Gold Cloaks would follow orders. They had assumed Sir Steffon, like so many others, would bend the knee for survival, but they had forgotten that loyalty, true loyalty, does not bend. In the chaos of the coronation, Sir Steffon slipped away from his post. He knew the secret passages of the Red Keep. Every Targaryen servant knew them, but few knights ever bothered to learn. He had learned them because he had always believed in the oath he swore, and that oath was not to a crown of gold in a dragon pit. It was to the rightful queen. He went to the royal vaults, not to steal gold or jewels, to retrieve the one object that could prove the Greens had stolen more than a throne. The crown of King Jaehaerys himself, the very circlet that had just been placed on Aegon's head. But wait, if that crown was now on Aegon, what was in the vault? The truth was more subtle. Jaehaerys had possessed two crowns. The one Aegon wore was a ceremonial replica made for feasts and tours. The true crown, the one worn at his coronation, the one with the rubies like drops of blood, had been kept safe in the strong room. Sir Steffon knew this, and he knew that the true crown, if brought to Rhaenyra, would be a symbol more powerful than any proclamation. He took it. He wrapped it in cloth, tucked it under his cloak, and he made his way toward the sea. The harbour was locked, but a man who knows the sewers knows how to reach the shore. He found a small skiff, one of the fishing boats that had been allowed to stay for the small folk's sake, and he rowed through the darkness, past the Blackwater Rush, past the blockade of green warships, heading east toward Dragonstone. Behind him, the city of King's Landing slept in ignorance. The lockdown held. No raven had flown, no lord had escaped, but one man, with a stolen crown and a heart full of defiance, was already on the water, and by the time the Greens realised what they had lost, Sir Steffon Darklyn would be standing before Rhaenyra, holding out the crown of Jaehaerys the Old King, and the true queen would learn that the usurper's crown was a lie built on blood. That moment, the moment Rhaenyra learned that her father's throne had been stolen, that her brothers had turned against her, that the city she called home was now a fortress of enemies. That moment is the birth of the Black Queen, and it is in that moment that we will find the next chapter of this story. The rushed coronation of Aegon, the second in the Dragonpit, had been a spectacle of gold and green, a thunderclap of betrayal that echoed through the stone corridors of King's Landing. The gates of the city had been sealed, the roads watched, and ravens grounded. No word of the usurper's crowning was meant to escape the Red Keep, but news like blood finds its way through the smallest cracks. A loyalist servant, a fisherman paid in silence, a smuggler's boat under cover of night. Somehow, a message reached the shores of Dragonstone, and when it arrived, it did not arrive gently. Rhaenyra Targaryen was in the chamber of the painted table when the raven came. She had been studying the narrow sea, tracing the routes her husband Daemon had once used to strike at the stepstones. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the carved map of Westeros. Her handmaid entered with a scroll, face pale, fingers trembling. Rhaenyra took it without a word. She broke the seal and read, and the world stopped. For a long moment she did not move. The parchment trembled in her hands. Her father, King Viserys, was dead. Not dead from a battle or a fever, dead from years of slow decay, rot eating him from within, and the Hightowers had let him rot alone. Worse, they had not waited for his body to cool before they placed a crown upon the head of her half-brother Aegon. Aegon, who was barely a man, who was drunk more often than sober, who had never wanted the throne, but his mother Alicent wanted it, Otto Hightower wanted it, and now they had it. The sound that escaped Rhaenyra's throat was not a scream, it was a low, shuddering wail, like the cry of a wounded dragon. She dropped the scroll and clutched the edge of the painted table, her knuckles white. Servants scrambled away. Her children, Jacaerys and Lucerys, rushed in to find their mother weeping, her face buried in her hands. Daemon arrived moments later, his expression dark as storm clouds. He picked up the scroll, read it, and his jaw tightened. He said nothing. He did not need to. The room understood war had begun. That night, Rhaenyra did not sleep. She walked the halls of Dragonstone, her steps echoing against black volcanic stone. She passed the dragon pit where Syrax stirred, sensing her rider's rage. She passed the nurseries where her youngest son, Aegon the Younger slept unaware. She stopped at the window that faced the distant shore of Blackwater Bay, where the lights of King's Landing flickered like a wound that would not heal. She thought of her father's final years, his body a ruin, his mind still clinging to the promise he had made her. She thought of the lords who had sworn oaths to her, kneeling in the great hall of the Red Keep, placing their hands on sacred texts and promising to defend her right. And now they had bent the knee to a usurper. The grief was not just for her father. It was for the betrayal of trust, the violation of law, the theft of her birthright. It was the grief of a queen who had been made an outlaw overnight. By dawn, that grief had hardened into steel. She called her council. Dragonstone had no great throne room, but the chamber of the painted table served as a war table. Around it gathered the lords and knights who had remained loyal. Prince Daemon, of course, his hand resting on the pommel of Dark Sister. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, his face weathered by salt and battle, his eyes sharp with calculation. Princess Rhaenys, the queen who never was, her silver hair pulled back, her gaze cold and knowing. And others, Maester Gerardis, the master of whisperers, Sir Eric Cargill, a knight of the Kingsguard who had fled the capital rather than serve the Greens. They were a small council, but they were fierce. Rhaenyra stood at the head of the table, her hands flat on the carved wood. She spoke slowly, each word deliberate. My father named me his heir. The lords of the realm swore to me, and now the Hightowers have crowned my brother in the Dragonpit. As if oaths mean nothing, she paused, looking at each face in the room. I will not bend. I will not hide. I will take the crown that is mine by right. And so she did. The coronation was not a grand affair. There was no dragon pit filled with cheering crowds, no procession through the streets of a city. It took place in the ancient hall of Dragonstone, beneath the gaze of dragon skulls that lined the walls. A simple crown of black iron and rubies, the crown of the conqueror's sister-wife, Rhaenys, was placed upon her brow by Daemon himself. She knelt before no scepter, no king. She rose as Rhaenyra Targaryen, the first of her name, Queen of the Andals and the First Men, Lady of the Seven Kingdoms. The Blacks had their queen, but a queen needs a council, and so the Black Council was formed. It was not a formal body like the small council of King's Landing. It was a gathering of warriors, sailors and schemers, bound by desperation and loyalty. Daemon was named Protector of the Realm, his hand steady on the reins of war. Corlys Velaryon became Master of Ships, commanding the largest fleet in Westeros. Rhaenys was given a seat of honour, her wisdom and her dragon melees, a force to be reckoned with. Other appointments followed. Lord Bartimos Celtiger as Master of Coin, Lord Manfred Mooten as Master of Laws. But the most crucial decision was yet to be made. How to fight a war against a brother who had stolen the throne, who commanded the loyalty of the great houses of the South. The Black Council debated for hours. The question was not whether to fight, but how. The Greens held King's Landing, the Reach, the Westerlands, and the Crownlands. They had gold, they had grain, they had the might of House Lannister and the numbers of House Tyrell. The Blacks had the North, the Vale, the Riverlands in parts, and the formidable naval power of House Velaryon. But the true currency of power in this war was not men or gold, it was dragons. Daemon spoke first, his voice low and urgent. We have 6 dragons here on Dragonstone. Syrax, Caraxes, Meles, Arax and Tyraxes. The Greens have Vargar, the largest dragon in the world, plus Sunfire, Dreamfire and Tessarion. They have fewer riders, but Vargar alone could turn a battle. He leaned over the table, his finger tracing the coast of the Crownlands. If we confront them in the field with armies, we will bleed. But if we strike from the sky, we can break their strongholds before they ever march. Rhaenys shook her head. Dragons are not invincible. We saw that in the Stepstones. A well-placed scorpion bolt can bring even a dragon down. And if we unleash our dragons on the capital, we risk burning the city we mean to rule. We must be careful, or we will win a kingdom of ash. Lord Corlys stroked his beard. The sea is our strength. We can blockade King's Landing, cut off their trade, starve them into submission. But that takes time. Time the Greens will use to rally the Reach and the Westerlands. He glanced at Rhaenyra. Your Grace, we need more allies. We need the Riverlands and the Stormlands to commit. We need ravens. Rhaenyra listened, her fingers drumming on the table. She knew the math of war. The Greens had perhaps 40,000 men under arms, counting the Lannister and Hightower levies. The Blacks could muster 30,000, perhaps 35. But they were scattered from Winterfell to the Eyrie. Dragons could even the odds, but only if used wisely. She looked at the map, at the red line that marked the border between Crownlands and Riverlands. She thought of her father's prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire, a threat that required a Targaryen on the throne, and here she was, fighting her own blood for that very throne. We will send envoys, she said at last, to every lord who swore an oath to me, to the Riverlands, to the north, to the Vale. We will remind them of their vows, and we will ready our dragons. She turned to Daemon. You will lead the first strike, not against King's Landing, against the castles that hold the roads. Break their supply lines. Show them that the Blacks will not sit idle, and smiled, a thin, dangerous smile, as my queen commands. The council dispersed, but Rhaenyra lingered at the painted table. She stared at the carved castle of King's Landing, the red keep marked in tiny runes. Somewhere in that city, her half-brother sat on her throne, wearing her father's crown, and somewhere in the dungeons, perhaps, her father's body still lay unburned. She would not let his death go unavenged. She would not let his legacy be stolen. But even as she planned, a knock came at the door. A raven had arrived from the capital, bearing a message not from the Greens, but from a man who had once been her father's most trusted hand. The letter was sealed with green wax. It was from Otto Hightower himself, and its contents would change everything. That message, and the fate of the envoy who carried it, would become the first test of Rhaenyra's reign. The next chapter of this war would not be fought with dragons or armies. It would be fought with words, with honour, and with the life of a messenger. What happened to the envoy would set the course of the Dance of the Dragons for years to come. The envoy's fate hung in the balance, and the answer would be written in blood. The war had now begun, but it was still a war of words and oaths, of ravens and false promises. Rhaenyra Targaryen, crowned the Black Queen on Dragonstone, understood that her claim to the Iron Throne would not be secured by bloodlines alone. She needed the great houses of Westeros to stand with her, to honour the oaths they had sworn to her father. And so, from her Black Council, she dispatched envoys to every corner of the realm. To Winterfell, she sent her eldest son, Jacaerys, riding the young dragon Vermax. To the Eyrie, she sent her second son, Lucerys, flying Arax, a dragon barely larger than a horse. It was a mission of diplomacy, but in times of war, diplomacy wears the mask of a gambler, and the stakes could not have been higher. Lucerys Velaryon, a boy of 14, took to the skies with a heavy heart. His destination was Storm's End, the ancient seat of House Baratheon, a fortress carved from black stone that faced the fury of Shipbreaker Bay. The Baratheons were a proud and stormy house, and their allegiance could tip the balance of the conflict. Lucerys carried a message from his mother, a reminder that her father King Viserys had once promised a marriage pact between their families, a promise broken when Rhaenyra was wed to Lyonor Velaryon instead. He hoped that Lord Boros Baratheon might still honour the old ties, that the memory of an unfulfilled vow might stir a sense of duty. But as Arax descended through the howling winds, Lucerys could not have known that another dragon had already landed before him. Inside the Great Hall of Storm's End, Lord Boros sat upon his throne of carved antlers, surrounded by his 4 daughters. The air was thick with salt and damp, and the torches flickered with every gust that slipped through the stone. Before Lucerys could even state his petition, a figure stepped from the shadows. A silver-haired prince, lean and cold, with a sapphire gleaming in his empty eye socket. It was Aemon Targaryen, Lucerys' uncle, and he had come to Storm's End for the same purpose. The Greens had sent him to secure the Baratheon alliance, and Aemon had brought with him the greatest weapon of the age, Vhagar, the she-dragon of Queen Visenya, a beast so vast that her wings could cast a village into twilight. The confrontation was immediate and venomous. Aemon mocked Lucerys, calling him a bastard and a coward, reminding him of the day years ago when a childhood fight had cost Aemond an eye, a wound inflicted by Lucerys himself. The hall fell silent as the two princes faced each other, one a dragon rider of Vhagar, the other a boy on a dragon barely old enough to hunt fish. Lord Boros, a man of blunt pragmatism, listened to both envoys, then made his choice. He would not break bread with the Blacks. He had no reason to honour a dead king's broken promise, and Aemon's offer, a marriage to one of his daughters, was simple and immediate. Lucerys was dismissed with a curt refusal. He had failed, but the danger was far from over. As Lucerys fled the hall and mounted Arrax, a storm was gathering over Shipbreaker Bay. The sky turned the colour of bruised iron, and the wind screamed through the battlements. He had to leave quickly, before the weather made escape impossible. Yet as Arrax launched himself into the gale, a shadow fell over them. Aemond had followed, and he had brought Vhagar. High above the churning sea, the chase began. Lucerys urged Arrax to fly faster, to climb into the clouds and lose the larger dragon in the darkness. But Vhagar was ancient and cunning, and her rider was driven by a cold fury. Aemond did not intend merely to frighten his nephew. He intended to teach him a lesson, to humble the boy who had once taken his eye. But the lesson would spiral into something far more terrible than either of them could imagine. Arrax, young and frightened, turned to defend himself. He breathed a burst of flame at Vhagar's enormous face, a defiant, desperate act. It was not enough to harm the old dragon, but it enraged her. Vhagar had been the mount of the Conqueror's sister. She had burned armies and laid waste to cities. No little dragon would spit fire at her and live. With a roar that shook the very air, Vhagar lunged. The collision was brutal and swift. Vhagar's jaws closed around Arrax's neck, and the young dragon's screams were lost in the roar of the storm. Lucerys tried to hold on, but the world turned upside down. He felt the snap of bone, the hot spray of blood, and then nothing but the cold grip of the sea. His body, broken and small, was swallowed by Shipbreaker Bay, and the waves took him without a trace. Aemond had not meant to kill. At least, that is what he would later claim. But the act was done. The son of Rhaenyra, the envoy of the Blacks, was dead, and with his death, the fragile line between political dispute and total war evaporated like mist in a dragon's flame. There would be no turning back now. Rhaenyra would not mourn in silence. She would demand blood for blood. The dance of the dragons had entered its darkest phase, where the death of a child would be answered by an atrocity so foul that the name of the next chapter would be whispered as a curse. The Hall of Storm's End had lit a fuse, and in the halls of Dragonstone, a mother's grief was already sharpening a blade that would fall not on a battlefield, but in the heart of King's Landing itself, a blade known to history as blood and cheese. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The storm had barely cleared from the skies over Shipbreaker Bay when the news reached Dragonstone. Rhaenyra's scream echoed through the stone corridors, a sound so raw it seemed to crack the very foundation of the island fortress. Her youngest son Lucerys was dead, not in battle, not in a duel, but hunted through a tempest by his own uncle, Aemond, atop the greatest dragon in the world. And the Greens did not weep. They celebrated. In King's Landing, the court of Aegon II toasted to the death of a boy, barely old enough to shave. But Daemon Targaryen did not toast. He did not weep either. He went very, very still. And in that stillness, he began to plan. Daemon had always been a creature of extremes, charming one moment, ruthless the next. But the loss of Lucerys was not just a military blow, it was personal. Lucerys was Rhaenyra's son, yes, but he was also the boy who had taken Daemon's own dragon egg to Storm's End, a boy who had called him father. Daemon had watched Rhaenyra's grief twist into something hollow, and he knew that the only language the Greens understood was blood. If they wanted war, they would have it. But he would not meet their armies on a field of honor. He would meet them in the dark, where honor meant nothing. So he summoned a man with a rat's face and a butcher's heart, a former city watchman turned cutthroat, known only as Blood, and alongside him, a man with no name at all, a former Kingsguard turned sellsword called Cheese. Their task was simple: infiltrate the Red Keep, find the family of the Usurper, and remind Aegon II that no crown could protect those he loved from the shadows. The Red Keep was supposed to be impregnable. Built by Maegor the Cruel, its walls were thick, its gates guarded, its tunnels sealed. But every fortress has secrets, and the keep had been built over an older city, a maze of forgotten passages, hidden doors and ancient drains. Daemon knew these tunnels intimately. He had played in them as a boy prince, and later used them for far less innocent purposes. He passed that knowledge to Blood and Cheese. They entered not through the main gate, not over the walls, but through a hole in the floor of a long-abandoned kitchen, crawling through filth and darkness, until they emerged inside the very heart of the Green Court. It was the depth of night when they found their way to the royal apartments. The halls were quiet, the guards lax, but no enemy had ever breached these walls. Blood moved like a shadow, Cheese like a whisper. They knew exactly where to go. The chambers of Queen Helaena, wife of Aegon II, mother of his children. Helaena was not a warrior. She was a gentle soul, given to fits of melancholy and strange prophetic utterances. That night she lay in bed with her youngest son, Prince Maelor, a child of barely 2 years. Her other children, the twins Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, slept in an adjoining room. The Greens had assumed that Rhaenyra would strike at their armies, not at their beds. They were wrong. Blood and Cheese entered the Queen's chamber without a sound. They had no torches, no lanterns, only the faint glow of the hearth, casting long distorted shadows across the walls. Helaena awoke to the feel of cold steel against her throat. Before she could scream, Cheese clamped a hand over her mouth. "Not a sound, Your Grace," he whispered, his breath hot and foul. "Or we take the boy first." She froze. Her son Maelor stirred but did not wake. The men pulled her from the bed, dragged her to the next room, where the twins lay sleeping. Jaehaerys was 6 years old, a golden-haired boy who dreamed of dragons and knights. Jaehaera, his twin sister, was curled beside him. Blood took Jaehaerys by the arm and shook him awake. The boy looked up, confused, and saw the blood-streaked face of a stranger. He began to cry. Helaena begged. She offered them gold, jewels, her own life in exchange for her children. Blood laughed, a low, ugly sound. "We're not here for treasure, girl. We're here for a son, for a son." He held a dagger to the boy's chest. "But we're not monsters. We'll give you a choice, sweet queen. Which one dies? The boy or the other boy? You pick." The impossible choice. A queen, mother to 3 children, forced to decide which of her sons would be slaughtered. The twins, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, were a matched pair, golden-haired, innocent, loved equally. But the command was clear: a son for a son. They wanted a prince's blood. And Helaena, trembling, tears streaming down her face, could not choose. She could not speak. She could only shake her head, over and over, as if denial could undo the nightmare. Cheese grew impatient. "Her mind's gone," he muttered to Blood. "She'll choose nothing." So Blood made the choice for her. He took Jaehaerys by the hair, forced the boy's head back, and with one swift, brutal motion, he cut the prince's throat. The child did not even have time to scream. Blood splashed across the white sheets, across the face of Jaehaera, who began to wail. Helena's own scream followed a moment later, a sound so terrible it woke the entire keep. But Blood and Cheese were already gone, lipping back into the tunnels, leaving behind a queen clutching the body of her son, covered in his blood. The guards arrived too late. The king's heir, the firstborn son of Aegon II, was dead, and in the aftermath, Helaena never truly recovered. Her mind, already fragile, shattered completely. She would spend the rest of the war in a haze of grief, speaking only in riddles and weeping for a child who would never grow old. Word of the murder spread through the Seven Kingdoms like poison. The Blacks had struck first, and they had struck at a child. Daemon's retaliation for the death of Lucerys was horrifying, yes, but it was also strategic. A son for a son, he called it, a message that no crown, no army, no wall could protect the Greens from his vengeance. But the cost was immense. In that single act of cruelty, the Blacks lost the moral high ground. The lords of the realm, who had once whispered sympathy for Rhaenyra's stolen birthright, now looked upon her with fear. A queen who allowed her husband to murder children in their beds was not a queen for peace, but a queen for blood. Rhaenyra herself was horrified when she learnt the details. She had not ordered the assassination, not explicitly, but she had given Daemon a free hand, and she did not punish him for it. That silence spoke louder than any command. From that night forward, the Blacks were no longer the righteous defenders of Viserys' will. They were just another faction in a war where children were currency and the dead were counted in years, not battles. And so the Dance of the Dragons descended into its darkest chapter. The murder of Jaehaerys was not the last atrocity, but it was the one that shattered any pretense of honour. When the lords gathered their banners, they no longer asked who had the truer claim. They asked who could protect their families, and the answer for many was no one. The war would soon move to the Riverlands, where a river would run red with the blood of houses who had chosen sides. A mill would burn, and with it, any hope of a quick end to the conflict. But before that fire, the memory of a golden-haired boy lying dead in his mother's arms would haunt every decision, every alliance, every battle yet to come. Next time, we cross into the burning fields of the Riverlands, where the first clash of armies proves that the crown is not won by assassins in the dark, but by soldiers in the mud. That is the story of the burning mill. The horror of that night in the Red Keep sent shockwaves through every corner of the realm, but it was only the opening wound. Blood and cheese had done their work. Queen Helena was shattered, her children marked by a terror that could never be undone. And in the dark quiet that followed, the war itself began to breathe, not in councils or coronations, not in whispered conspiracies behind stone walls, but on the open fields of the Riverlands, where old hatreds had never truly died. They had only been waiting. You see, the Riverlands have always been a crucible. For centuries, its lords fought and bled and burned for scraps of land and pride, and no feud ran deeper than the one between House Bracken and House Blackwood. Their enmity predated the Targaryens, predated the Andals, predated even the First Men, if you believe the songs. They were sworn enemies, bound by blood and bitterness, and when the Dance of the Dragons split the realm in two, they did not hesitate to choose sides. The Brackens of Stonehenge declared for the Greens. The Blackwoods of Raventry Hall stood with the Blacks. And so it was that the first major land engagement of the war would not be fought by Targaryen princes or dragon riders, but by two ancient houses who had been sharpening their knives for generations. The Battle of the Burning Mill was not a grand clash of armies. It was a brutal, intimate slaughter fought beside a stream that had seen countless petty skirmishes before. The Brackens came first, marching under the golden stallion of their house, confident that the Blackwoods would cower or be crushed. But the Blackwoods were not cowards. They rode out from the shadow of their weirwood tree, banners black as death, and met the Brackens in the shallows. The fighting was savage, personal, merciless. Men who had grown up within a day's ride of each other, who had shared markets and taverns and grudges for decades, now tore into each other with sword and axe and bare hands. The mill itself caught fire, a beacon of smoke and flame that rose above the river as witness to the carnage. And when the sun set, the Blackwoods stood victorious. The Brackens were broken, scattered, fleeing back to Stonehenge with their tails between their legs. But the Battle of the Burning Mill was more than a victory for the Blacks. It was a signal, a terrible, unavoidable signal, that the war would revive ancient blood feuds across the Riverlands. What had begun as a succession crisis in King's Landing now unfurled into a patchwork of vengeance and old scores, each lord eager to settle a grievance that had festered for centuries. The Brackens and Blackwoods were only the first. Soon, the Darries would rise against the Mootons, the Vances against the Pipers, the Freys against everyone. The Riverlands became a churning sea of fire and steel, and at its centre, a single man understood exactly how to use that chaos to his advantage. That man was Prince Daemon Targaryen. Daemon did not simply want to win a war. He wanted to break the spirit of his enemies, to send a message that would echo through the ages. And so, fresh from the shadow of blood and cheese, he turned his gaze toward Harrenhal, that cursed, colossal fortress on the shores of the God's Eye, the largest castle in all of Westeros, built by Harren the Black in defiance of dragons, only to be melted and twisted by Aegon the Conqueror. For nearly 2 centuries, Harrenhal had stood as a monument to ambition and ruin, a place of haunted halls and whispered legends. Its sheer size made it nearly impossible to garrison, and its reputation made it a burden to hold. But as a strategic and psychological stronghold, it was unmatched. Daemon knew that whoever controlled Harrenhal controlled the Riverlands. From its towers, he could threaten the crossroads of the realm, cut supply lines, and compel the Riverlords to bend the knee. He took the castle with almost no bloodshed. The garrison, commanded by a minor Bracken loyalist, had no stomach to face the rogue prince and his dragon Caraxes. They fled before him, or surrendered, and Daemon walked into Harrenhal as its master. But he did not simply occupy it. He made it his throne, his lair, his weapon. He filled its halls with his own men, raised the black banner of Rhaenyra over its battlements, and let the legend of his return spread like wildfire across the countryside. The Riverlands had no king, but they now had a warlord, a prince of fire and blood, seated in the very fortress that had once defied his ancestors. And there, in the shadow of Harrenhal's twisted towers, Daemon waited. He knew that the war was only beginning. The Greens would not sit idle after the humiliation of Storm's End and the horror of the Red Keep. They would send armies, they would send dragons, and they would come for him. But Daemon had never been a man to wait passively. He began to send out riders, to court the Riverlords, to fan the flames of rebellion. And in the distance, beyond the smoke of the burning mill, another storm was gathering, one that would sweep away not just armies, but the very hope of peace itself. That storm had a name, a queen and a dragon of her own, but her fall would come not from the battlefield, but from the poison of trust betrayed. And when it did, the entire war would tilt on its axis, forever changing the shape of the dance of the dragons. For now, though, the fire of the mill still smouldered, and Daemon sat in the black stone of Harrenhal, thinking of a woman who had once been called the realm's delight, and of a throne that would soon demand more blood than any kingdom could afford. The news of the burning mill spread fast across the Riverlands, and with it came a grim truth that no one could ignore. The war between the dragons was no longer a distant threat whispered in the halls of King's Landing. It had become a bloody, open conflict that would soon devour everything in its path. But the Greens, with Sir Criston Cole at the head of their armies, understood something the Blacks had not yet fully grasped. They knew that the surest way to win this war was not to fight on the ground, but to turn the skies into a killing field. So Criston Cole devised a trap. He and Prince Aemond crafted a plan so brutal, so precise, that it would change the course of the war in a single stroke. They chose Rook's Rest, a small castle held by a loyal house of the Blacks. But it was not the castle itself that mattered, it was the bait. Cole and Aemond gambled that the Blacks would send their most powerful dragon riders to defend it. And they were right. The trap was simple. Aemond would hide Vargar in the woods nearby, concealed behind the tree line, while Criston Cole would march on Rook's Rest with a small army. They would make a show of force, draw out the black dragons, and then spring the ambush. But they needed a dragon large enough to lure in the biggest threat. So Aegon II, the king himself, rode Sunfire into the trap, flying openly over the burning fields, daring the Blacks to come, and they did. The Red Queen, Meleys, with Rhaenys Targaryen astride her, descended from the clouds in a fury of crimson scales and roaring flame. Rhaenys had been called the Queen Who Never Was, but she was still one of the most feared dragon riders in all the Seven Kingdoms. She bore down on Aegon and Sunfire, and the battle began. But it was a battle meant to be a slaughter, as Meleys and Sunfire locked in combat, tearing at each other in the sky above the burning castle. A second shadow emerged from the forest, Vargar, the largest dragon alive, older than the Targaryen dynasty itself, rose into the air with Prince Aemond guiding her. And now it was 3 dragons, twisting and burning in a dance of death that no one had ever seen. The clash was deafening. Sunfire, golden and fierce, bit into Meleys' wing. Meleys retaliated with a stream of fire that caught Sunfire across the throat. Blood and smoke filled the air, but then Vargar struck. The ancient beast sank her teeth into Meleys' neck, and the Red Queen roared in agony. Rhaenys fought with every ounce of courage she had, driving her dragon deeper into the fight, trying to tear Sunfire apart, even as Vargar tore into her. It was a brutal, hopeless struggle. Aegon II, reckless and young, flew too close. Sunfire took a terrible blow, a strike that shattered the dragon's chest and sent both king and dragon plummeting toward the earth. Aegon crashed into the burning castle below, his body broken, his dragon crippled. But the fight was not over. Vargar grabbed Meleys by the throat and pulled. The Red Queen's screams died in a gush of flame and blood. Rhaenys Targaryen, the Queen Who Never Was, fell from the sky with her dragon, her body lost in the inferno below. The Greens had won, but the cost was staggering. King Aegon II was carried from the rubble, a broken man, his skin burned, his bones shattered, his mind forever changed. He would never ride a dragon again. He would never rule as the man he had been. The crown now sat on a crippled king, and the true power belonged to Aemond, the one who had slain the Red Queen. And yet the war was far from over. Rhaenys' death sent a shockwave through the Black faction. They had lost their greatest dragon rider, and the Greens had taken the sky. But desperation breeds strange alliances, and Rhaenyra Targaryen would soon turn to a solution that no one had ever dared consider. She would look to the basest born, the forgotten, the bastards of the Targaryen bloodline. She would sow the seeds of a new war in the very ashes of the old. And that story, the story of the Dragonseeds, would change everything. The smoke from Rook's Rest still hung heavy over the eastern coast when word reached Dragonstone. Rhaenys Targaryen was dead. Meleys, the Red Queen, had fallen beneath the fangs and claws of Vargar and Sunfire, and Prince Aemond, riding the largest dragon alive, had not even been scratched. The Blacks had lost their most experienced warrior and their most formidable dragon, short of Vargar itself. Rhaenyra, already broken by the loss of her son Lucerys, now had to face a truth she had tried to ignore. Her cause was bleeding dragons faster than her enemies, and there were no more Targaryen princes left to ride the beasts that still slept beneath the Dragonmont. That is where Jacaerys Velaryon stepped forward. He was young, barely past 20, but he had seen his brother die in the sky. He had watched his mother's grief turn into a cold, calculating anger, and he knew, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that the war could not be won with oaths and armies alone. The Greens had Aemond, they had Aegon, though Sunfire was wounded. They had Daeron in the Reach with Tyraxes, and they had the wild cards of the Riverlands, where dragons were already burning villages, without riders answering to any crown. The Blacks needed more riders, and the only place left to find them was on the very island where the dragons had been born. Dragonstone had always been more than a fortress. It was the cradle of the Targaryen dynasty, a volcanic island where the blood of old Valyria still ran thick in the soil. And in its mountain, the Dragonmont, there were dragons that had never been claimed. Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, once ridden by King Jaehaerys the Conciliator, Silverwing, the gentle queen of Queen Alizanne, and the wild ones, Sheep Stealer and Grey Ghost, and the cannibal that lurked in the shadows. These were not hatchlings. These were great beasts, some nearly as old as Vargar, but no one had dared to approach them for decades. The blood of the dragon had thinned, they said. Only a true Targaryen could bond with such power, and the true Targaryens were all dead or at war. Jacaerys, however, remembered the old stories. He remembered that the Targaryens had not always been pure. For generations, the lords of Dragonstone had fathered bastards on the women of the island, the same women who worked the fields, tended the sheep, and served the castle. Those children carried the blood of the dragon, even if it was diluted. And if a dragon could be bonded by a true-born prince, why not by a bastard? It was a desperate gamble, a roll of the dice that could either save the blacks or doom them. But after Rook's Rest, there was no other choice. Rhaenyra, seated on the painted table, heard the plan in silence. She had lost so much already: her father, her son, her cousin, and now she was being asked to trust the children of her father's indiscretions, the offcasts of the Targaryen legacy. To ride the most powerful weapons in the world, she gave her consent. Perhaps she saw it as a way to honour her father's memory. Perhaps she simply had no other option. And so the proclamation went out to every village, every fishing hamlet, every nameless corner of Dragonstone and Driftmark. Any man or woman who could claim descent from the blood of the dragon, however, was invited to claim a dragon. They called it the sowing, a word that should have evoked hope and harvest, but instead carried the weight of a last chance. Hundreds came. Some were honest fishermen who swore their grandmother had been a Targaryen's mistress. Others were driftwood from the alleys of Spice Town, men who had never touched a saddle in their lives. They were given no training, no armour, no counsel. They were simply led to the Dragonmont, to the dens of the great beasts, and told to try, and they died. Sheep Stealer, the wild dragon that terrorized the flocks of Dragonstone, tore apart the first 5 men who approached him. Grey Ghost vanished into the sea mist, leaving only bones on the shore. The cannibal, that ancient terror that ate its own kind, simply killed anyone who came near. But the great dragons, the ones that had once carried kings and queens, were more patient, and 3 men stepped forward who would change the course of the war. Adam of Hull was a young shipwright, the son of a Velaryon bastard. He had grown up on Driftmark, working in the shipyards of his grandfather Corlys. Though he had never been acknowledged, he was quiet, steady, with the same silver hair that marked the old blood. He walked up to the slumbering form of Seasmoke, the dragon that had belonged to Laenor Velaryon, and, without hesitation, he placed his hand on its snout. The dragon opened its eyes, sniffed him, and then accepted him. It was as if the beast had been waiting. Then came Hugh Hammer. He was a blacksmith, a giant of a man with arms like iron and a temper to match. He had always known he was different, stronger, fiercer than the other boys. And when he approached Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, he did not kneel. He shouted. He cursed the dragon, called it a coward, dared it to burn him. And Vermithor, the great golden beast that had once answered only to a king, lowered its head and allowed Hugh to climb onto its back. Ulf the White was the strangest of them all. He was a drunk, a layabout, a man who had spent his life in the kitchens of Dragonstone, boasting of his Targaryen blood, but doing nothing with it. When the call came, he stumbled into the Dragonmont, half drunk, and found Silverwing, the dragon of the gentle queen. Silverwing was known for her kindness, but also for her reluctance to bond with anyone new. Yet Ulf, in his foolishness, simply walked up to her and started talking. He told her jokes. He sang a bawdy song, and to everyone's astonishment, the great white dragon curled around him like a cat. 3 new riders, 3 new dragons. For a moment, it seemed the blacks had won the lottery. Jacaerys' plan had worked. The Dragonseeds had risen. But the sowing had also planted something else. Hugh and Ulf were not noblemen. They were not loyal to Rhaenyra's cause. They were opportunists, men who had been given power they had never earned and could not control. And Adam of Hull, though loyal, was a bastard in a world that despised bastards. They were wild cards, and in a war fought with fire and blood, Wildcards burn everything. The Blacks now had a numerical advantage in dragons, but that advantage came with strings of ambition and resentment. Hugh Hammer looked at the Iron Throne and saw a seat he could claim. Ulf the White saw gold and wine, and when the Greens heard of the sowing, they smiled, because they knew that dragons bonded to desperate men are not dragons that stay loyal forever, and so the war continued. The next battle would not be fought in the sky over some forgotten castle. It would be fought in the open sea, where the Velaryon fleet ruled, and where a boy prince would be forced to face the cost of his mother's war. The Gullet was waiting. The sowing had given Rhaenyra a handful of new dragon riders, but it had also given her a new kind of fear. These were not loyal lords bred for the court. They were bastards, Dragonseeds, men and women who had never known the weight of a crown or the cost of a dragon's flame. Jacaerys Velaryon saw the danger even as he welcomed the advantage. He knew that the war would not be won by dragons alone. The seas, the supply lines, the coin, all of it belonged to his grandfather, Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, and the Sea Snake's fleet was the backbone of the Black cause. But the Triarchy had been watching. For years, the free cities of Tyrosh, Lys and Mire had chafed under Velaryon dominance of the Narrow Sea. They had not forgotten the wars. Corlys had fought against them in his youth. Now, with the realm torn in two, they saw their chance. They struck not at Dragonstone, not at Driftmark directly, but at the heart of Velaryon power, the Gullet, the narrow channel that fed the Blackwater Bay. And they did not come with honour. They came with fire, with steel, with a fleet hidden behind the mist of a dawn that should have brought hope. The Velaryon fleet was caught at anchor near Spicetown. The Triarchy's ships, sleek, fast, crewed by men who had spent their lives raiding the coastlines of Essos, swept in before the lookouts could raise the alarm. The first volley of arrows and grappling hooks was followed by the brutal boardings. There was no room for dragons to breathe fire in the chaos. The ships were too close, the wind too fickle. Prince Jacaerys, riding his dragon Vermax, tried to intervene from the sky, diving low to blast the enemy vessels with flame. But the Triarchy had prepared for that. They had crossbowmen, scorpions, and a cunning plan. A lucky bolt from a giant crossbow, the kind used to hunt whales in the summer sea, struck Vermax in the wing joint. The dragon screamed, a sound that carried across the bay like a funeral bell. Jacaerys struggled to keep control, but Vermax was wounded, faltering. The beast crashed into the sea not far from the burning hulks of Velaryon ships, and in that cold, churning water, the heir to the Iron Throne, the most capable leader the Blacks had, the young man who had brokered alliances, who had flown to the wall for support, who had given everything for his mother's cause, was lost. His body was never recovered. The Triarchy's sailors sliced through the waves, looking for trophies, but the tide took him first. When the news reached Dragonstone, Rhaenyra did not weep in public. She screamed. She screamed until her voice gave out. Then she sat in silence, staring at a map of the realm, as if waiting for a different history to unfold. But history had already written its cruelest line. Without Jacaerys, the Black faction lost its most capable strategist, its most beloved prince, and its only direct heir with a dragon. The sowing had bought them riders, but it could not buy back the future. Spicetown, the wealthy port that had made House Velaryon's fortune, was not spared. The Triarchy's raiders poured into the town, looting, burning, and slaughtering. The streets ran with the blood of merchants and sailors alike. The great warehouses, filled with cloves and cinnamon and silks from the east, went up in smoke. By the time the battle was over, Spicetown was a blackened ruin, and House Velaryon had lost more than ships. It had lost its place as the uncontested power of the Narrow Sea. The Sea Snake would spend the rest of the war trying to rebuild, but the wound never healed. And yet, even in that disaster, there was a grim irony. The Triarchy, for all their cunning, had not come to win the war for the Greens. They had come to settle old scores. Their victory at the Gullet bought Aegon time, but it also bought Rhaenyra a new resolve. When the tears finally came, they were not tears of defeat. They were the tears of a mother who had nothing left to lose, and that is a dangerous thing. Because a mother with nothing left to lose is a mother who will burn the world to ash to see her enemies fall. The next chapter of this war would not be fought on the sea. It would be fought in the shadows of King's Landing, where a city waited, vulnerable, and where one woman's grief would become a weapon more terrible than any dragon. The Battle of the Gullet had shattered the Black Fleet and taken Prince Jacaerys Velaryon, the heir to the Iron Throne, into the cold black water. Rhaenyra's most capable son, the architect of the Dragonseeds strategy, was gone, and yet, in the wake of that devastating loss, the Black Queen did not retreat into grief. She saw the board more clearly than ever, with the Triarchy scattered and the Velaryon fleet battered but not broken. A window had opened, one that could only be exploited by a ruler willing to risk everything. Rhaenyra understood that her half-brother Aegon II lay, wounded in the Red Keep, burned and broken after the battle at Rook's Rest. His brother Aemond had declared himself regent, but the one-eyed prince was not in the capital. He was deep in the Riverlands, hunting for Daemon Targaryen, riding Vargar, the largest dragon in the world. The Greens had left King's Landing, guarded only by a skeleton garrison and a handful of lesser dragons. Aegon II could not fly, Helena was no warrior, and Daeron was far away in the Reach. It was the moment Rhaenyra had been waiting for, a tactical masterstroke born from patience and precise intelligence. She gathered her forces, not on the shores of Dragonstone, but in the very shadows of the capital. While Aemond burned villages and chased phantoms across the Riverlands, Rhaenyra's dragon Syrax took to the air alongside the newly claimed dragons of the Dragonseeds. Vermithor, Silverwing and Seasmoke. They flew not in a great formation, but in scattered pairs, avoiding detection until they converged over the city walls at dawn. The people of King's Landing woke to the sight of dragons circling the Red Keep, their wings blotting out the morning sun. There was no battle, no firestorm. The gold cloaks melted away, the gates were thrown open, and the Greens fled like rats from a sinking ship. Queen Alicent Hightower, her daughter Helena, and the young children of Aegon II were smuggled out through hidden tunnels beneath the castle. Aegon himself, too injured to ride, was carried in a litter to a secret location, his dragon Sunfire spirited away to an unknown refuge. The hand of the king, Otto Hightower, was captured in the throne room, still clutching the royal seal, and so Rhaenyra Targaryen, the named heir of Viserys, walked up the iron steps of the throne she had been denied for so long. She did not sit gracefully. She cut her hand on a twisted blade, and the blood dripped onto the cold metal as she took her seat. The Black Queen had captured the Iron Throne, but triumph curdled quickly into dread. The treasury, which should have overflowed with gold from a century of Targaryen rule, was empty. The Greens had stripped it bare, shipping vast sums to Casterly Rock, an old town before their flight. Coffers that should have paid the city watch, fed the starving populace, and funded the war effort held only dust and echoes. Rhaenyra's first night as queen was not spent in celebration, but in frantic calculation. She had the throne, but she had no money, and without gold, loyalty is a currency that evaporates fast. The financial crisis was immediate and brutal. She tried to raise taxes, but the small folk, already suffering from war and blockade, had nothing left to give. She ordered the melting of ceremonial plate and the seizure of church ornaments, but it was a drop in an ocean of debt. The Dragonseeds who had fought for her began to murmur, wondering if their promised rewards would ever come. Hugh Hammer and Ulf the White, in particular, grew restless. They had tasted power and they wanted more. The Iron Throne, Rhaenyra realised, was not a prize. It was a cage lined with swords. In the dark hours of that first night, he looked out over the Blackwater Rush from the Queen's chambers. The city below was silent, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the quiet of a held breath, a pause before the next blow. And in the Riverlands, Aemond Targaryen had finally realised he had been led on a fool's errand. He turned Vargar's massive head south, and the war was far from over. The The stage was set for a showdown that would come to be known as the Butcher's Ball. The Iron Throne was in black hands, but the war was far from over. Rhaenyra sat in the Red Keep, the usurper's crown now resting on her brow. Yet the crown felt heavier than she had ever imagined. The city that had once been her father's pride now whispered with the ghosts of betrayal. But across the Riverlands, the Green Army still bled the land, and at its head, the man who had made Aegon the usurper king. Criston Cole, the Kingmaker, was marching his battered forces back toward King's Landing, unaware that the hunters had already gathered. The Butcher's Ball was not a battle in the traditional sense. There was no clash of armies drawn up in neat lines, no heraldic charges across an open field. Instead, it was a trap, sprung with the cold patience of a wolf pack. After the fall of the capital, the green forces in the Riverlands were in disarray. Prince Aemond had taken Vargar and flown north to burn the Loyalists, leaving Ser Criston to command a shattered army. The Kingmaker's reputation had been forged in the tourney yards and the stepstones, but the war had bled him dry. His men were starving, their morale broken by the loss of King's Landing and the relentless harrying of the River Lords. They retreated south, hoping to reach the safety of the Reach. But the Rivermen and the Winter Wolves had other plans. The ambush came at a place called the Crossroads, a muddy stretch of road near the Mander. The Black forces had concealed themselves among the trees and the reeds, their armour wrapped in cloth to muffle the clatter. As the Green Column trudged forward, exhausted and demoralised, the first volley of arrows struck from the woodline. Then came the howl of the Winter Wolves, wild Northmen who fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They poured out of the forest, axes and swords gleaming in the pale light, and the slaughter began. Ser Criston Cole's army was not prepared for the savagery of this attack. The Kingmaker himself fought bravely, cutting down a dozen enemies with his Morning Star, but his men were breaking, running, dying in the mud. In the midst of the carnage, a knight of the Black faction, Lord Roderick Dustin of the Winter Wolves, rode forward and called out for Ser Criston to yield. The Kingmaker, still proud, threw down his helmet and demanded a trial by combat. He would fight any champion of the Blacks, he said, and let the gods decide. But the Rivermen had no patience for chivalry. They had seen too many villages burned, too many innocents butchered by the Green Army. Lord Roderick shook his head and ordered the archers to loose. The refusal of the duel was final. Ser Criston Cole, the man who had crowned a king and destroyed a dynasty, fell to a dozen arrows, his body crumpling into the blood-soaked earth. The Kingmaker was dead, unmourned, unceremoniously executed like a common traitor. The shift in momentum was immediate and absolute. With their commander slain, the Green Ground forces disintegrated. The lords who had once sworn to Aegon the Usurper now fled, threw down their banners, or were cut down by the relentless charges of the Winter Wolves. The Riverlands had been a charnel house for months, but the Butcher's Ball marked the end of any organised green resistance in the region. Rhaenyra's enemies were being driven back to the last strongholds, and her cause seemed unstoppable. But in the victory, a seed of mistrust was planted, a seed that would soon grow into the First Betrayal. The next chapter will reveal how the very men who fought for the Black Queen turned against her, and how the war took a darker turn. The First Betrayal was coming. No one was ready for its venom. The fall of Ser Criston Cole at the Butcher's Ball had sent a shock through the realm. The Greens had lost their most capable commander, the man who had orchestrated the trap at Rook's Rest and led the coup that crowned Aegon II. For Rhaenyra, the victory should have been a moment of pure triumph. King's Landing was hers, the Iron Throne was hers, and now the army that had marched against her was shattered. But as the sun set on that bloody field in the Riverlands, a different kind of darkness was gathering. A darkness born not from enemy steel, but from the very hearts of those she had trusted most. To understand what happened next, you have to remember the desperate gamble that had given Rhaenyra her greatest strength. The sowing of the Dragonseeds had brought new riders to unclaimed dragons, common-born bastards of Targaryen blood who had never dreamed of sitting a saddle. Adam of the Hull claimed Seasmoke. Nettles climbed onto the back of Sheepstealer, and two others, Hugh Hammer and Ulf the White, bonded with the ancient beasts Vermithor and Silverwing. They were hailed as heroes, but they were also men of low birth and high ambition, and the taste of dragonfire had a way of twisting a man's soul. The Black Army had split after the capture of King's Landing. Rhaenyra remained in the capital, trying to hold her fragile throne together, while a host of thousands marched south under the command of Lord Mouton and other loyalist nobles. Their goal was to take the town of Tumbleton, a vital crossroads that controlled the roads into the Reach. If Tumbleton fell, the path would be open for the Green's remaining forces to rally, but the Black Army carried with it two dragons, Hugh Hammer on Vermithor and Ulf the White on Silverwing. They were supposed to be the ultimate weapons, the fire that would burn the enemy into submission. No one suspected they would soon turn that fire on their own. The First Battle of Tumbleton began with the Black Army arrayed in the fields south of the town. The Greens had gathered what forces they could. Lord Ormond Hightower, a cousin of the late Alicent, led a mixed host of Reachmen and sellswords. They were outnumbered, but they had a secret weapon of their own. Daeron Targaryen, the youngest son of Viserys and Alicent, riding the blue dragon Tessarion. But Daeron was not the only dragon in the sky that day. As the lines clashed and the fighting became a slaughter, the Black Army's cavalry broke through the Green lines. Victory seemed certain. And then, amid the smoke and the screams, Hugh Hammer raised his hand. He had been promised lands and titles by Rhaenyra, but whispers had reached him of greater rewards from the other side. Perhaps it was greed. Perhaps it was the seduction of power that came with riding the second largest dragon in the world. Whatever the reason, Hugh turned Vermithor away from the enemy and brought his fire down upon the ranks of the Black Army. Ulf the White watched. For a moment he hesitated. Then Silverwing, the dragon that had once belonged to Queen Alizanne, opened her jaws and bathed the black soldiers in flame. The betrayal was complete. The very dragons meant to protect Rhaenyra's cause had become its executioners. The Black Army dissolved in chaos. Thousands burned alive by the beasts they had trusted. Lord Mouton and many of the northern lords perished under the onslaught. The Greens, stunned but quick to seize the moment, charged into the disarray and finished what the dragons had started. Tumbleton would not fall that day. Instead, it became a grave. News of the defection reached Rhaenyra in King's Landing like a blade through the heart. She had already been growing paranoid. The loss of her son Jacaerys at the Gullet, the constant pressure of holding a throne built on blood and oaths, the whispers of treachery in every corner of the Red Keep. It had eroded whatever trust she had left. Now, with the names of Hugh and Ulf added to the list of traitors, she could no longer separate friend from foe. Her thoughts turned to the other Dragonseeds, still loyal to her. Adam of the Hull, who had proven himself in battle. Nettles, who had bonded with the wild Sheepstealer and fought alongside Daemon in the Riverlands. But in Rhaenyra's mind, they were no longer heroes, they were threats. She issued the order. The remaining Dragonseeds were to be arrested. Adam, learning of the decree, fled the capital before the guards could take him. Nettles, stationed with Daemon near Harrenhal, was warned by the prince himself, who urged her to escape. Rhaenyra's paranoia had turned her into the very thing she had fought against. A ruler who saw enemies in her own house, who burned the bridges that kept her safe. The first betrayal had been Hugh and Ulf's, but the second was hers. The betrayal of trust, the poisoning of the loyalty that had won her the throne, and the war was far from over. In the Riverlands, beyond the reach of ravens and royal decrees, a different kind of storm was brewing. Prince Aemond, mounted on Vargar, had been burning and looting for months. He had not forgotten the death of his brother, nor the humiliation of losing King's Landing. Now, with the black forces scattered and divided, he saw his chance. But his eyes were fixed on a single target, a man who had become his obsession. a man who rode Caraxes through the smoke of the Riverlands like a demon from old Valyria. Rhaenyra's husband, Daemon Targaryen. Their confrontation, when it came, would not be a battle of armies. It would be a duel of dragons, a death spiral above the lake known as the God's Eye, and it would change everything. The smoke from Tumbleton still stained the sky when the news reached Harrenhal. The First Betrayal had shattered Rhaenyra's cause more surely than any dragon flame. Hugh Hammer and Ulf the White, men lifted from the mud by the Queen's own decree, had turned their cloaks and their stolen dragons against her. The Black Army in the Reach was broken, scattered like ash before the wind. And now the woman who had sat the Iron Throne for less than a moon's turn faced a truth no crown could soften. The Greens were not beaten, they were gathering. Prince Daemon Targaryen knew this better than anyone. He had taken Harrenhal in the name of the Blacks, that cursed fortress of black stone and molten towers, where the air still whispered of Harren the Black's final screams. But holding it meant little when the largest dragon in the world was hunting through the Riverlands. Aemond One-Eye, mounted on Vargar, the she-dragon who had once borne Queen Visenya to war, whose wings could swallow a village in shadow, was cutting a bloody path toward the Trident, and Daemon on Caraxes, the Bloodworm, was the only man who could meet him. They were two veterans of 100 battles, two princes of the blood who had each killed their own kin without flinching. Daemon had fed the city of King's Landing to his dragon in the Street of Silk. Aemond had burned the Riverlands from the God's Eye to the Blackwater Rush. Neither was a stranger to cruelty, nor to the weight of a crown they believed was theirs by right. And now the war had boiled down to this, a single duel in the sky above the lake that gave the region its name. The confrontation had been inevitable since Lucerys Velaryon's death, since Aemon chased the boy into a storm and fed him to Vargar. But Daemon had waited. He had let the Greens exhaust themselves, let the River Lords bleed the enemy's strength, let Rhaenyra's rule crumble under its own weight. Perhaps he had always known that the true battle would not be for thrones or cities. It would be for the soul of House Targaryen itself. So when the scouts reported Vargar's approach, a shadow moving across the sun, vast as a thundercloud, Daemon did not flee. He mounted Caraxes, the great red serpent whose howls could shatter stone, and rose to meet her. The two dragons met above the God's Eye, a circular lake so deep that no man had ever touched its bottom. Below them, the water gleamed like polished obsidian, reflecting the fire that would soon consume the sky. They circled each other, the old and the young, the cunning and the reckless. Aemond was a boy no longer, 20 winters old, but hardened by war and the loss of his eye. He had grown into his cruelty, had learned to wield Vargar not as a beast, but as an instrument of godlike destruction. Daemon, by contrast, was nearly 50, a man grown grey in the saddle, his body scarred by 1,000 skirmishes. But he had something Aemond lacked: patience and despair. The legendary final confrontation between Daemon Targaryen and Aemond One-Eye began with fire. Vargar and Caraxes locked together, their roars shaking the very air, their claws raking deep wounds into each other's hides. The lake below churned with the storm of their combat. Aemond, from his saddle, hurled insults Daemon could not hear, his one eye fixed on the enemy he had hated since childhood. Daemon said nothing. He was counting breaths, watching the rhythm of Vargar's attacks, waiting for the opening that would end this war. And then he did what no man had ever done. He leaped, not a fall, not a stumble. He stood in his stirrups, Dark Sister in his hand, the blade of Visenya, the sword that had conquered a continent, and he jumped from Caraxes onto Vargar. For one impossible moment, he hung in the air, a figure of black and red, a prince of dragons defying the laws of men and gods, and he crashed onto the back of the ancient she-dragon, landing behind Aemond, who turned in shock, his sapphire eye glinting in the firelight. They fought there, atop Vargar's armoured spine, while the two dragons tore at each other and the lake rushed up to meet them. Daemon drove Dark Sister through Aemond's skull, through the eye socket that held the gem, into the brain beneath. Aemond died without a scream, his body pitching forward, and Daemon followed him down as Caraxes, mortally wounded, fell from the sky with Vargar locked in a death grip beside him. The plunge into the lake was absolute. The waters swallowed dragon and rider alike, closing over them like a tomb. For hours the surface was still. Then Caraxes, half dead, dragged himself ashore and died on the muddy bank. Vhagar sank forever, her bones settling into the silt at the bottom of the God's Eye, and Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, the kingmaker, the man who had loved his brother and hated his nephews, who had burned and killed and wept, vanished without a trace. No body was ever found, no sword, no crown, only the legend remained. For the Blacks, his death was a blow from which there was no recovery. Rhaenyra had lost her hand, her heart, her most feared commander. The war had claimed its two greatest veterans, the most terrifying combatants the realm had ever seen, and with them, it took the last hope of a decisive victory. The Greens, for all their scheming, had lost their Dragon King's brother, the one rider who could truly command for Hagar. Both sides were now crippled, bleeding out in the ruins of their own ambition. And as the sun set over the God's Eye, a different kind of storm was brewing back in King's Landing. The common folk had seen dragons fall. They had watched their city burn. They had felt the weight of an endless war press down on their shoulders. And they had begun to ask the question no one dared answer. What would happen if the dragons themselves turned on the city? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would begin with the roar of a mob and the shattering of the Dragonpit. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The leap from Caraxes to Vargar, the plunge into the cold, dark waters of the God's Eye, and the silence that followed. Those were the final acts of two of the most fearsome dragon riders the world had ever known. Daemon Targaryen and Aemond One-Eye, locked in a fury that could only end in mutual destruction, vanished beneath the lake, leaving the realm in a strange, breathless void. For Rhaenyra, the news of Daemon's death was a wound that cut deeper than any blade, but she had no time to mourn. The capital she had fought so hard to seize was beginning to rot from within, and the cracks in her rule were widening into canyons. You see, King's Landing was starving. The war had choked the trade routes. The fields of the Reach were burnt, and the autumn harvests had been meagre for 2 years running. The common folk, those who packed the muddy streets of Flea Bottom and the crowded hovels along the Blackwater, had watched their children grow thin, and their bellies swell with nothing but water. And what did they see when they looked to the Red Keep? They saw a queen who feasted on capons and sweetmeats while the city starved. They saw dragons, great beasts of legend, devouring more meat in a single day than 100 families could afford in a month. The resentment simmered, slow and quiet at first, but it would soon boil over. Among the ragged crowds, a figure emerged from the shadows of the great sept of Baelor. He was a simple man, a septon of no great lineage, known only as the Shepherd. He had a voice that crackled with a raw, desperate fire, and he preached a sermon that struck a chord deeper than any noble's decree. He said, the dragons were not gifts from the gods but punishments. He said the Targaryens had brought famine and war upon the innocent, and that the beasts of fire and blood were abominations that must be cleansed. His words were a balm to the starving, a justification for their rage, and a call to arms. The shepherd did not ask for bread, he asked for blood, and the city listened. Day by day, the crowds outside the dragon pit grew larger, angrier. They remembered the battles that had raged overhead, the fire raining down on farmers and fishermen. They remembered the screams of the dying at Tumbleton, the smoke that choked the sky for weeks. The shepherd gave them a target, a single undeniable enemy: the dragons themselves, tethered and helpless in the great domed pit atop Rhaenys' hill. Then came the night that shattered everything. It was the 23rd day of the 10th moon of the year 130 after the conquest. The mob, 1,000 strong, surged up the hill. They They carried torches, scythes, hammers, and the righteous fury of the desperate. The Dragonpit's gates, built to hold the most powerful creatures in the world, were not designed to keep out a starving multitude. The guards were overwhelmed in minutes. The doors swung open, and the people poured inside. The dragons were chained. 5 of them: Tyraxes, the young dragon of Prince Joffrey; Dreamfire, the gentle blue queen of the late Helena; Syrax, Rhaenyra's own golden mount; and 2 smaller dragons, Stormcloud and Morgul, barely more than hatchlings. They had nowhere to flee. The mob surrounded them, hacking and stabbing with a frenzy that was almost religious. The dragons roared, spat flame, crushed dozens of attackers underfoot. But there were too many. The shepherd himself led the charge, his voice rising above the chaos. Dragon after dragon fell, their blood pooling on the stone floor, mixing with the blood of the common folk. The great dome shook with the sound of desperate death, and in the midst of that slaughter, Prince Joffrey, a boy of only 13 years, tried to mount his dragon Tyraxes. He had hidden in the pit, perhaps to defend his mother's mount, perhaps to prove himself a man. The mob did not care who he was. They dragged him from the dragon's saddle and beat him to death with rocks and fists. His body was left broken among the carcasses. When news reached the Red Keep, Rhaenyra's world collapsed. Her son, her last living son from her first marriage, was gone. The queen who had once commanded the loyalty of half the realm now commanded nothing. The mob had done what no army had achieved. They had stripped her of the one thing that made her invincible, her dragons. And the sun rose the next morning. The Dragonpit was a charnel house. 5 dragons lay dead, their bodies torn and mangled. The shepherd stood atop the rubble, his robes stained with blood, and declared that the gods had cleansed King's Landing. But the city was not cleansed. It was broken. Rhaenyra's authority evaporated like morning mist. The lords who had once bowed to her now whispered behind her back. The gates of the capital stood open, and the people no longer feared her. The war was far from over, but in that single night, the Targaryen dream of dominion through dragons died, and Rhaenyra, battered and alone, would soon find that the only path left to her was the one that led away from the throne she had sacrificed everything to claim. But where she fled, and what awaited her in that flight, is a story for another night. The mob had not yet finished its work when the first tongues of flame licked at the Red Keep's outer walls. The shepherd's sermon had broken the dam of fear that held the city together, and now the tide of rage swept through every street and alley. Rhaenyra stood in the Tower of the Hand, watching from a high window as the Dragonpit's dome collapsed in a shower of stone and smoke. She could hear the distant screams, not just of men, but of something far older, something that had been the soul of her house. The dragons were dying, one by one, and with each death, her claim to the throne grew thinner, more fragile, more desperate. She had not eaten in 2 days. The city's granaries were empty, and what little food remained was hoarded by the mob. Her guards had dwindled to a handful of loyal knights, their armour dull with grime and dried blood. The treasury in the keep had been looted weeks ago, emptied by the retreating Greens or by starving servants. Rhaenyra's own jewels, the rings on her fingers, the silver combs in her hair, all had been sold to buy whispers of loyalty that never came. She had one last treasure, the crown of Viserys I, the golden circlet set with rubies and onyx, worn by her father and by every Targaryen king before him. It was the symbol of everything she had fought for. But symbols do not feed children, nor do they buy passage across the Blackwater. She called for her remaining son, Aegon the Younger. The boy was barely 9 years old, pale and hollow-eyed from the siege. He had seen his mother's kingdom crumble. He had seen his uncle Aemond fall into the lake, seen the mob tear his half-brother Joffrey from his dragon. He clung to Rhaenyra's hand as she led him down the secret passage that wound beneath the keep, a tunnel her father had shown her when she was a girl. The passage was cold and damp, reeking of rat droppings and old stone. Behind them, the sounds of the riot grew muffled, then faded into an eerie silence, broken only by their own breathing. They emerged into the ruins of a stable yard near the river gate. The sky was the colour of bruised iron, choked with ash. A few boats still bobbed in the current. But their captains were not eager to help a queen who could no longer pay. Rhaenyra approached a fisherman, a man with weathered hands and a face that had seen too many winters. She offered him her last silver, a few coins she had kept hidden in her boot. He shook his head. She offered her rings. He stared at them, then at the smoke rising from the Dragonpit, and shook his head again. Finally, she took the crown from her head. The circlet was warm from her skin. She held it out, her fingers trembling. The fisherman's eyes went wide. He did not ask questions. He knew what it was. He took the crown, the symbol of an empire, and in exchange gave her a salt-crusted rowboat and a promise to take her and the boy as far as Dragonstone. The crossing took most of the night. The wind was sharp, cutting through her thin cloak. Aegon lay curled at her feet, shivering, his head in her lap. She watched the lights of King's Landing shrink and blur until they were nothing but a smear of orange on the horizon. The capital was burning. Everything she had built was burning. She had lost 3 sons, lost her husband, lost her father's throne. All she had left was this boy, and the hope that Dragonstone would offer a refuge. She had sent word ahead to the castle's garrison. Men sworn to her for years, commanded by a knight named Sir Robert Quince. They had held the island for her through the war. She trusted them. She had to trust them. When the boat scraped against the volcanic shore, the sky was just beginning to pale. The castle loomed above, black against the grey dawn. No torches lit the battlements. No guards came down to meet her. Rhaenyra helped Aegon out of the boat, her legs weak from the journey. The fisherman had already turned his boat back toward the city. Clutching his crown, she did not look back. They climbed the slick stone path, her hand never leaving her son's. The gates were open, too open. The courtyard was empty. The stables were empty. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She called out for Sir Robert. No answer. She called again, her voice echoing off the damp walls. Then she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the keep's main hall. Not the footsteps of a loyal garrison, the footsteps of men who had been waiting. The doors swung open. Sir Robert Quince stood there, but he was not alone. Behind him, men of the household guard, their eyes hard, their hands resting on sword hilts. And beside him, a figure she knew all too well. Lord Bartimos Celtigar, one of her own counsellors, who had slipped away from King's Landing weeks ago. He smiled, a thin, pitying smile. In his hand, he held a scroll sealed with the 3-headed dragon, but the seal was cracked. The message inside, she would learn, was from Aegon II, who had not died in the fall of the city. He had fled, regrouped, and sent ravens to every loyalist stronghold, and Dragonstone, it seemed, had chosen a new master. Rhaenyra understood then. The escape, the burning city, the lost crown, all of it had been for nothing. She had walked into a trap. The trap had been laid the moment she fled the capital. Perhaps it had been laid the moment her father died. She pulled Aegon closer, pressing his face into her skirt, trying to shield him from what was coming. She looked at the faces of the men she had once commanded. Some had been with her for years. They did not meet her eyes. And in that moment, as the cold wind off the narrow sea bit at her cheeks, Rhaenyra Targaryen, the Queen of the Blacks, the rightful ruler of the 7 Kingdoms, realised that her flight was over. The next chapter of her story would not be written in a castle tower or on a battlefield. It would be written in a dungeon, by torchlight, with the sound of iron closing behind her. But even as she stood there, the trap complete, a faint hope remained, a hope she did not yet dare to name. Her son, Aegon the Younger, was still alive, and in the shadows of the keep, there were those who remembered a different oath. The trap at Dragonstone was about to close, but the jaws that snapped shut would not hold forever. She had sold her crown for passage. That heavy circlet of gold and rubies that once sat upon her father's brow, now traded to a Braavosi merchant for a berth on a rat-infested cog. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the queen who never was, returned to Dragonstone with nothing but the clothes on her back. her last surviving son Aegon the Younger, and a handful of loyalists who had not yet abandoned her. The island loomed out of the grey sea, its volcano breath painting the sky with thin ribbons of ash. Dragonstone had always been her refuge, her birthplace, the seat of her power, but the fortress was silent as they approached, its towers dark. The great stone dragon perched above the gate, staring down like a gargoyle waiting for a prayer. The landing was cold and damp. No servants came to greet her, no guards snapped to attention. The doors of the stone drum stood ajar, and inside the great hall, a fire burned low in the central hearth. Rhaenyra must have felt something then, a tremor in the air, the way a hunted animal senses the trap a heartbeat before the jaws close. For she was exhausted, hollowed by months of flight and famine, by the loss of every child she had borne, by the betrayal of the very lords who had sworn to defend her. She walked forward, her boots echoing on the stone, and that is when she saw him. Aegon II sat in her father's chair, propped up by cushions, his face pale and twisted with pain. He was a ruin of a king. His body was wrapped in bandages, soaked through with old blood and ointment. His left side crushed from the fall during the Battle of Rook's Rest, his skin charred where dragonfire had kissed him. For months, the realm had believed him dead or fled beyond the narrow sea. The Greens had spread the story that Aegon had been slain in the God's Eye, alongside his brother Aemond, that the throne was now vacant. But here he was, hidden in the very heart of his enemy's stronghold, nursed in secret by a handful of loyal servants, waiting. The revelation that a wounded Aegon II had been hiding on the island for months changed everything. It meant that Rhaenyra's flight to Dragonstone was not an escape, but a deliverance right into his hands. She stopped. The child Aegon clutched her arm, but she gently pushed him behind her. For a long moment, the two monarchs stared at each other across the hall. Rhaenyra, once so beautiful, now grey-faced and thin, her hair streaked with white and her eyes hollow with grief. Aegon, once so arrogant, now a broken shell of a man, his breath rattling in his chest. There was no pretense of diplomacy, no offer of terms. The final confrontation between the two rival monarchs on the shores of their ancestral home had arrived, not as a clash of armies or a flight of dragons, but as a whispered, terrible stillness. Aegon spoke first, his voice a rasp. "You should have stayed in the capital, sister. You should have died there." She did not answer. Perhaps she thought of Syrax, her dragon, who had been left behind in King's Landing and was now dead, slaughtered in the Dragonpit by the mob. Perhaps she thought of Daemon, her husband, who had given his life to kill Aemond. Perhaps she only thought of her son, the boy trembling behind her. Then the sound came, a low grinding rumble that vibrated through the stone floor, followed by the heavy scrape of claws. From a side passage, a dragon emerged. But this was not the gleaming golden beast of song and legend. Sunfire, the dragon of Aegon II, had been grievously wounded in the same battle that had crippled his rider. His hide was scarred, one wing torn and hanging, his tail dragging, but he was still a dragon, and the fire in his throat had not gone cold. He limped into the hall, his golden scales catching the firelight like tarnished treasure, and he fixed his yellow eyes on Rhaenyra. This moment would become the war's most gruesome execution. Aegon did not order it with words. He simply looked at his dragon, and Sunfire understood. The beast lunged. There was no time for a scream, no time for prayer. The jaws closed around Rhaenyra Targaryen, and she was gone. The dragon devoured her in full view of her son, who stood frozen, unable to look away. The queen who had once commanded the loyalty of half the realm, who had ridden Syrax above the King's Landing, who had named herself queen and fought for her birthright, was reduced to a mouthful of meat and bone. Aegon II watched, his face unreadable, and then he turned his gaze to the boy. That boy, Aegon the Younger, would be taken prisoner and forced to kneel. He would be paraded through the castle, made to witness the corpse of his mother being picked clean by the dragon. And when Sunfire finally died of his wounds days later, the boy would be chained in a tower, waiting for a death that never came. For the war was not over. The green victory at Dragonstone was hollow. The black cause would not die with Rhaenyra. Already lords in the Riverlands and the north were rallying around another claimant, and the dragons that remained were few and scarred. But for now, the throne of the Seven Kingdoms belonged to Aegon II, a king crippled in body and soul, sitting alone in the hall of his enemy, listening to the distant crash of the sea. The story does not end with a feast or a crowning. It ends with a boy in a cell, a dragon's belly full of his mother, and a king who cannot stand without help. And what comes next is not a peace, but a reckoning. In the next chapter, we will witness the final act of the Dragon Queen's tragedy, a death so dark that even the histories try to look away. She had finally made it home, Dragonstone, the island of her birth, the ancestral seat of her dynasty, the place where she had once been a princess, a mother, a queen in waiting. But as Rhaenyra Targaryen stepped onto the black sand of the shore, she saw no loyal guards, no welcoming banners. She saw her brother, Aegon II, broken and bandaged, sitting on a stolen throne of driftwood and stone, surrounded by the few men who still called him king. He had been hiding here for months, licking his wounds after the fall of King's Landing, waiting for her to fall into his trap, and she had walked straight into it. The men who had escorted her from the capital were dead or scattered. Her last son, Aegon the Younger, stood trembling at her side. She had sold her crown to buy passage on a fishing boat. She had no dragon, no army, no allies within a day's ride. All she had was the name she had fought for, the claim she had bled for, and the bitter taste of a war that had already eaten everything she loved. Aegon looked at her with eyes that held no mercy, only the cold satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time for this moment. He did not rise. He did not speak. He simply nodded, and his men moved forward. They seized her. They dragged her through the courtyard of the ancient fortress, past the stone dragons that guarded the gates, past the hall where her father had named her heir, past the chamber where she had given birth to children, who were now all dead but one. And then they brought her to the place where the dragons were kept, to the cavern beneath the keep where Sunfire, Aegon's golden dragon, lay wounded but still alive. The beast had been mauled in the battle at Rook's Rest, its wings torn, its body scarred, but it still breathed fire. It still hungered. They tied her hands. They forced her to her knees. And then in front of her son, they released Sunfire. The dragon did not need to be commanded. It smelled her fear. It remembered her scent. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the realm's delight, the first woman to sit the Iron Throne, was devoured alive. The golden jaws closed around her, and the screams that echoed through the cavern were not the screams of a queen, but of a mother, a woman, a mortal thing of bone and blood. Her son, Aegon the Younger, was forced to watch. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply stared, and something inside him died with her. That was the horrific end of Rhaenyra Targaryen, devoured by her brother's dragon in front of her son. And so Aegon II claimed a victory, but it was a hollow one, a victory built on ashes and the corpses of his own kin. He had won the throne, but at what cost? His dragons were dead or dying. His brothers were gone. His own body was wrecked from the poisons and the burns. He had no heirs left but the boy, who now hated him with a silence that was louder than any war cry. He ordered the histories rewritten. He decreed that Rhaenyra's reign was illegitimate, that she had never been queen, that her name should be struck from the record. He burned her letters. He melted down her sigils. He commanded the maesters to call her only the Pretender. But you cannot erase a war by erasing a name. The realm remembered. The North remembered. The Riverlands remembered. Despite the Queen's death, the war did not end. The Blacks had other leaders, other banners. Lord Cregan Stark of Winterfell had marched south with an army of 10,000 spears. The Riverlords, under the command of Lord Kermit Tully and Lord Benjicott Blackwood, had not laid down their arms. They had heard the rumours of what happened at Dragonstone, and they did not believe them, or they did not care. They had sworn an oath to Rhaenyra, and they would see her son, the true heir, placed on the throne. The dance of the dragons was not over. It was entering its final, most desperate act. Aegon II sat in the Red Keep, surrounded by the silence of a city that had once cheered his coronation. He had the throne, he had the crown, but he had no friends, no allies, no one left to trust. His own mother, Alicent Hightower, had turned against him, horrified by the brutality he had unleashed. His small council was a nest of vipers, and beyond the walls, the north wind was howling, carrying with it the sound of marching boots and the promise of a reckoning. The king who had won by feeding his sister to a dragon was about to learn that some victories leave nothing to rule over. What happened next would be the shortest and strangest reign in Targaryen history. A few weeks of terror and paranoia that ended with a cup of poisoned wine and a boy king who would forever be known as Aegon the Broken. The story of that final act, the brief and bloody rule of the Dragon Eater, is the subject of our next chapter. Rhaenyra Targaryen was dead. Aegon II had watched her consumed by Sunfuzz flames, her bones crackling on the black sands of Dragonstone. Her son Aegon the Younger forced to witness every scream. For a brief, sickening moment, the war seemed over, but victory in the dance of the dragons never came clean. It came like a wound that would not close, festering in the dark, waiting to kill the man who thought he had won. Aegon II was himself a cripple. His body, broken from the fall at Rook's Rest, had never fully healed. He could not walk without pain, could barely sit the Iron Throne. The crown he had fought so desperately to claim now felt heavier than any dragon, and yet when his advisors whispered of peace, of bending to the inevitable, he refused. He would not negotiate with traitors. He would not share the throne with Rhaenyra's son. He would rule alone, or he would burn the realm to ash trying. So he gathered his shattered court and set sail from Dragonstone, leaving behind the smoking ruin of the Targaryen ancestral home. His destination was King's Landing, but the city he returned to was not the one he had left. The capital he entered in the 130th year after the conquest was a corpse. The storming of the Dragonpit had done more than kill 5 dragons. It had shattered the very idea of Targaryen invincibility. The streets were filled with the bones of the mob who had died, with the reek of old fires, with the hollow stares of survivors who had seen their king flee, while a mob tore his monsters apart. Aegon II came home to a kingdom that no longer feared him. He rode through the gates of the Red Keep on a litter, too broken to sit a horse. Citizens lined the streets, but they did not cheer. They watched in silence, their faces unreadable. Some perhaps remembered Rhaenyra's brief rule, remembered the gold she had spent to feed them, remembered the promise of a queen who had at least tried to hold the city together. Aegon offered them nothing but war. He refused to send envoys to the armies marching south. He refused to hear the petitions of lords who begged him to sue for peace. He burned letters, dismissed councillors, and spoke only of vengeance. His mother, Queen Alicent, watched from the shadows of her chambers. She had raised this boy, had crowned him, had schemed for a decade to place him on the throne. But now she saw what she had created. A broken king, a hollow crown, a realm bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Alicent began to suspect that the dance had never been about dragons or law or succession. It had been about her own pride, her father's ambition, and now it had devoured everything she loved. She tried to reason with her son. He would not listen. Word came from the Riverlands that the remnants of the Black Cause had rallied. They called themselves the Lads. Young, reckless, and utterly without mercy, they were the sons of lords who had died for Rhaenyra. Lord Kermit Tully, only 19, led a host of riverlords. Lord Benjicott Blackwood, barely 16, commanded archers who knew every hill and ford, and behind them, marching south with the slow, unstoppable weight of winter itself, came Cregan Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, at the head of 10,000 northern spearmen. They had been summoned by Rhaenyra's last commands. They were coming to finish what she had started. Aegon II still had dragons. Sunfire, scarred but alive, brooded in the dragon pit. A few other beasts remained, tethered and terrified. But the days of aerial dominance were over. The mob had shown that even dragons could be killed by men with stones and torches, and now the Greens themselves began to crack from within. The internal conspiracy stirred in the quiet corners of the Red Keep. Lord Larys Strong, the Clubfoot, had always been a whisperer, a man who collected secrets like coin. He saw what others refused to see, that Aegon II could not win, that the war was lost, that the only way to save the Green cause was to end it. He began to speak with Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, whose loyalty had always been to the realm more than to any faction. Corlys had watched his wife Rhaenys die at Rook's Rest, had seen his grandson Lucerys murdered at Storm's End, had buried his own son in the war. He was tired of blood. Together, Larys and Corlys plotted in shadows, not to betray Aegon, but to end him before he destroyed what little remained of the Targaryen name. They would need a blade. They would need a poisoner, a cupbearer, a moment of trust, and they would need the king to be blind enough to believe that his own court still loved him. Aegon II, isolated in his ruined city, surrounded by hollow walls and empty promises, walked straight into the trap they laid. He had no idea that the final act of the dance would not come from the northern host, nor from the lads, nor from any battlefield. It would come from a cup handed to him by a friend, in a chamber lit by candlelight, while the realm held its breath and waited for the poison to take hold. And that poison, when it came, would carry a name that still echoes through the histories of Westeros. The poisoned cup, the poisoned cup. Aegon II had won. He had watched his sister burn, had fed her to his dragon, had returned to his city a conqueror. But victory was a hollow thing in a capital that smelled of rot and ash. King's Landing was a corpse, and the king who ruled it was already drinking from a cup that would seal his fate. The mysterious death of Aegon II is not just a footnote in the histories. It is a locked room mystery that has haunted the maesters for centuries. Did he fall to poison? And if so, whose hand poured it? The city had surrendered before the first black banner crested the horizon. The lads, the young lords of the Riverlands, Lord Kermit Tully and Lord Benji Cott Blackwood, had marched south with their armies. Above them flew the banners of Cregan Stark's northern host, a winter wolf catching the wind. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to end the war. But when they arrived at the gates of King's Landing, they found a city that had already thrown down its arms. The Green Council, what remained of it, had no stomach for more blood. They knew that the realm had been bleeding for 2 years, that the Iron Throne was a throne of bones. So they opened the gates. They offered terms. But the king, Aegon II, was not among those who greeted the northern lords. He was found in his chambers, slumped over a table, a half-empty flagon of wine beside him. The wine had been sweet, the maesters later confirmed, but laced with a slow-acting poison. The king's lips were blue. His eyes, still open, stared at the ceiling, as if searching for a dragon that would never come. The immediate surrender of King's Landing to the approaching black armies was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a war that had begun with fire and treachery. The lords of the Green faction, led by Lord Baratheon and the remnants of the Hightower party, fell over themselves to pledge fealty to the new regime. They had no choice. The black armies were at the gates, and the king was dead. But who killed him? The histories offer 3 names, each with a motive, each with a shadow of evidence. The first is Mushroom, the court jester. Mushroom had been a fool, yes, but he was also a survivor. He had witnessed the worst of the war, had seen Rhaenyra's fall, had watched the dragons burn. Some say he poisoned the king out of vengeance, a final joke from the jester who had nothing left to lose. Others say he acted on orders from someone higher. Mushroom himself, in his scandalous testimony, claimed that the Queen Helena, had given him the poison. Helena, Aegon's own wife, had been a quiet, broken figure throughout the war. She had lost her children, her dragons, her mind. Could she have finally snapped and taken the king with her? The maesters dismissed this as the ravings of a fool, but fools sometimes speak the truth. The third suspect is the council itself. The Green Lords had seen the writing on the wall. Aegon II was a stubborn, vengeful king who would never bend. If he remained alive, he would drag the realm into another war. A war they could not win, so they poisoned him, some say, to save their own skins. They delivered his head, or rather, his empty throne, to the Black Army as a peace offering. The debate over who truly killed the king remains unresolved to this day. But what we do know is that Aegon II died alone in a cold room with no dragon at his side. The last dragon of the Greens had already been slain in the Dragonpit. The last king of the Greens had no fire left in him, and so the war ended, not with a battle, but with a cup. The hour was dark, and the kingdom was empty. But the story was far from over. The hour that followed would be called the Hour of the Wolf, and it would bring a reckoning unlike any the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen. When the poison took King Aegon II, the city of King's Landing did not erupt in chaos. It surrendered. The gates were thrown open, and the banners of the Black faction were raised once more over the Red Keep. But the throne itself stood empty. For a few breathless days, the realm held its collective breath, waiting to see who would dare to sit upon it. The answer came not from the south, but from the frozen north. Lord Cregan Stark, the Warden of the North, had been marching his army south for months, and now he arrived in the capital with thousands of men hardened by winter. He was not a man known for mercy, and the capital was about to learn what that meant. Cregan Stark's 6-day reign as Hand of the King began the moment he entered the throne room. He found the city in a state of moral decay, its streets still slick with the blood of the Civil War, its nobles whispering and scheming, and its treasury empty. The surviving lords of the Green faction had already begun to squabble over terms of surrender, hoping to save their own skins by blaming each other. But Cregan Stark had not come to negotiate. He had come to deliver justice, and his justice was cold, swift, and absolute. Within hours of his arrival, he declared himself Hand of the King, not for a king who was present, but for the boy king who would be crowned once the city was purged. That boy was Aegon III, Rhaenyra's son, who had been hidden away in the Vale during the final months of the war. The mass arrests and executions of those who conspired against both Rhaenyra and Aegon II began immediately. Cregan Stark did not distinguish between green and black. He saw only traitors, and in his eyes, nearly every lord who had served in King's Landing during the war was guilty of treason. The first to fall were the men who had sat on Aegon, the second small council. Lord Larys Strong, the Master of Whisperers, was dragged from his chambers in chains. Sir Marston Waters, the commander of the City Watch, was arrested at his post. And then came the arrests of the minor players, the stewards and the cupbearers, the maesters who had turned a blind eye, the septon who had blessed the usurper's crown. The dungeons of the Red Keep filled so quickly that guards had to chain prisoners in the courtyards. Cregan Stark's method was simple. He would hear each case himself, seated in the great hall with the Iron Throne looming behind him. He allowed no lawyers, no appeals, and no mercy. The accused were given a chance to speak, but their words rarely mattered. The Wolf of Winterfell had already made up his mind, and the sentence was always the same: execution by the axe. And so, day after day, the heads of the conspirators rolled into the straw. The noble houses of the South watched in horror as northern justice was meted out without regard for birth or title. Even those who had fought for Rhaenyra were not safe. Cregan Stark judged them for the chaos they had allowed to spread, for the dragons they had lost, for the children who had died. It was a purging fire, and it consumed dozens of lives in the span of a single week. But the executions were only the beginning. The stabilization of the realm through northern steel and the crowning of Aegon III required more than blood. It required order. Cregan Stark put his own men in charge of the City Watch, replacing the corrupt sellswords with men who answered only to him. He reopened the gates of the city to trade, sending word to the Reach and the Riverlands that the war was over, and that any lord who rebelled against the new king would face the same fate as those who had already fallen. He even forced the great houses to send hostages to Winterfell as a guarantee of their loyalty. It was a heavy-handed peace, but it was a peace nonetheless. On the 6th day of his handship, Cregan Stark called a great council in the throne room. All the surviving lords and ladies of the court were summoned, and they came trembling, expecting more heads to fall. Instead, Cregan Stark announced that the time for justice was over. The boy king, Aegon III, would be crowned on the morrow, and Cregan Stark would step down as hand, for his work was done. He had brought the north to bear upon the south, had cleansed the court of its worst offenders, and had set the stage for a new reign. Then, true to his word, he laid down the pin of the hand and walked out of the throne room without a backward glance. His army marched back to Winterfell, leaving behind a kingdom that was battered but breathing. The crowning of Aegon III was a sombre affair. The boy king was only 10 years old, and he had seen his mother devoured by a dragon. He had seen his family torn apart, and he had spent the war as a pawn, a hostage, a ghost. Now he sat upon the Iron Throne, which seemed too large for him, too sharp, too cold. The maesters placed the crown of Jaehaerys, the first, upon his head, and the lords of Westeros knelt once more, but the cheers were hollow. There were no dragons to celebrate the coronation. The last of the great beasts were dead or gone, and the skies were empty. The realm was stable, but broken, and at the heart of that brokenness sat a child king who had been forced to watch his mother die. That is the legacy of the Hour of the Wolf, a legacy of northern steel and northern justice, a legacy of blood and sorrow. And what would become of this boy king? What kind of ruler would emerge from the ashes of the Dance of the Dragons? That is the story of the Broken King, and we will explore it in the next chapter. The Hour of the Wolf had passed. Cregan Stark, having delivered his grim brand of justice, marched his northern host back to the frozen lands he called home. The heads that had rolled in the great hall of the Red Keep were buried or burned, and the blood on the floor of the throne room was scrubbed away by servants who refused to meet each other's eyes. But the silence that settled over King's Landing was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a kingdom holding its breath, waiting for something, anything that might resemble a future. And at the centre of that silence sat a boy of 10 years, a boy who had seen too much, a boy who would never, ever forget. His name was Aegon Targaryen, the son of Rhaenyra and her uncle Daemon. But he was not called Prince Aegon anymore. He was King Aegon III, the boy king, the broken king. And his reign began not with a celebration, but with a funeral. The realm had lost 2 monarchs in the span of weeks. Rhaenyra had been fed to a dragon in front of her own son. Aegon II had been poisoned in his own bed. The Iron Throne, that monstrous seat of twisted swords, had claimed yet more victims, and now it waited for a child who barely came up to its armrest. The lords and ladies of Westeros understood one thing clearly. This war had to end. It had to end completely. If any ember of the dance remained, if any faction still nursed a grudge, or whispered of a better claim, the realm would burn again. So they did something that, in any other time, would have been considered madness. They arranged a marriage. Not just any marriage, but a marriage between the son of Rhaenyra and the daughter of Aegon II. The boy who had watched his mother die would take as his wife the girl whose father had ordered that death. Jaehaerys Targaryen, the young daughter of Aegon II, and his sister wife, Helaena, was a child of 7 when she was betrothed to Aegon III. She was the last of her line, the only surviving child of the Green King, and she would be queen. The coronation was a sombre affair. No grand feast, no tourney, no streets lined with cheering small folk. The city was still scarred from the war, still hungry, still suspicious. Aegon III was crowned in the Dragonpit, that hollow shell of a building where the dragons once roosted. Now it was empty. The great iron gates groaned as they opened, and the boy king walked in, his silver hair catching the pale light that filtered through the broken dome. He wore a simple crown, not the heavy ornate thing that Aegon the Conqueror had worn, but a lighter circlet, as if someone had realised that a child's neck could not bear too much weight. He did not smile. He barely looked at the gathered lords. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. And what did he see? What did the boy king see when he closed his eyes at night? When the torches were dimmed and the servants left his chambers? What came to him in the dark? He saw his mother. He saw her on Dragonstone, her body torn, her blood pooling on the black sand. He saw Vhagar's enormous jaws, the fire, the screaming. He saw his mother die, and he saw the dragon that killed her, and he saw his uncle's face twisted in triumph. That image never left him. It was burned into his mind with a clarity that no amount of time could soften. The broken king did not speak of it. He never spoke of it, but everyone around him knew. They saw it in the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he froze when a shadow passed over the court, the way he could not look at a dragon. But there were no dragons left to fear. That was the cruel irony. The dance of the dragons had done what no enemy could ever do. It had all but exterminated the creatures that made the Targaryens gods. Of the 20 or so dragons that had soared over Westeros at the start of the war, only a handful remained. Silverwing, once ridden by Queen Alysanne, now wandered the wilds, riderless and wary. Vermithor, the great bronze beast, was a ghost of his former self, dying slowly in a cave. The cannibal still lurked on Dragonstone, but he was a monster, even among dragons, a creature that had always been alone. And then there was morning. A young dragon hatched near the end of the war, a pale, delicate thing that seemed more a symbol than a weapon. The Targaryen dynasty, which had built its power on the backs of dragons, now had nothing but a few half-wild relics and a hatchling. The age of fire and blood was over. The regency that followed was known by a name that whispered of abandonment. They called it the Regency of the Abandoned. Aegon III was too young to rule. So a council of regents was formed, a collection of lords and maesters and former enemies who were tasked with holding the realm together while the boy king grew. But they were not a united front. They were the abandoned children of a broken war, the leftovers, the ones who had survived when so many others had not. There was Lord Unwin Peake, a man of ambition and petty cruelty. There was Grand Maester Munchen, a scholar who tried to impose order on chaos. There were others, each with their own agenda, their own grudges, their own secret hopes of gaining power for themselves. And they did not trust each other. They could not trust each other. The wounds of the dance were too fresh, too personal, and so the regency was a slow grinding process. Rebuilding a shattered Westeros was never going to be quick. The riverlands were a wasteland. Fields salted, villages burned, the bones of thousands bleaching under the sun. The Reach had lost its brightest lords. The Stormlands were in chaos. The North had bled heavily at the Butcher's Bull. The Crownlands were depopulated, the roads empty, the trade routes silent, and King's Landing itself was a city of widows and orphans, a place where every second person had lost someone to the war. Food was scarce, coin was scarcer, the treasury was empty. The regents argued over every penny, every appointment, every decision, and through it all, the boy king sat in silent judgment, watching, remembering. He did not speak much. When he did, his words were soft, hesitant. He had a habit of staring into the distance, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Some said he was haunted. Some said he was touched by madness. Others said he was simply broken, a child who had been asked to carry a burden that would have crushed any adult. He grew thin, pale, withdrawn. He did not play. He did not laugh. He attended his lessons with a hollow obedience, but his tutors could see that his mind was elsewhere. He was a king without a kingdom, a dragon rider without a dragon, a boy without a childhood. The marriage to Jaehaera took place a year after his coronation. It was a quiet ceremony, held in the Sept of the Red Keep, with only a handful of witnesses. The bride was 7, the groom 10. They stood together before the altar, 2 children who had been thrust into a union designed to end a war. They did not hold hands. They did not smile. They did not even look at each other. They stood side by side, small and pale, surrounded by the ghosts of their families. The septon spoke the words, the crowns were placed, and the realm exhaled. The line of Rhaenyra and the line of Aegon II were one. The dance of the dragons was officially over, but the dance never truly ended. Not for Aegon III. It lived inside him, a wound that would not heal, a memory that would not fade. He would reign for decades, but he would never truly rule. He would be a king in name, but in his heart, he would always be that boy on the beach of Dragonstone, watching his mother die. And that is the true dark truth of the Dance of the Dragons. The war did not end with a treaty or a triumph. It ended with a child who could not escape the nightmare of what he had seen. It ended with a broken king on a throne of iron, a king who would carry the weight of that war until his dying day. And what of the world he left behind? What of the legacy of that brutal, unforgiving conflict? The slow unravelling of Targaryen power, the disappearance of dragons, the seeds of distrust that would grow for generations. All of that is yet to come. But for now, the boy king sits in his cold chamber, staring at a tapestry of a dragon he will never ride. The fire is low, the night is long, and the next chapter of this story, a chapter called The Dark Legacy, waits just beyond the turning of the page. Aegon III was king, but the throne he sat upon was hollow. The boy who had watched his mother devoured by dragonfire now ruled over a kingdom that was itself a corpse, its flesh picked clean by war, its bones bleaching under a sky that had fallen silent. The dragons were gone. Not just the great beasts that had once made House Targaryen seem like gods among men, but the very idea of them. The dance had stolen something irreplaceable, and the silence that followed was louder than any roar. When the last embers of the war smouldered out, the dragon count was devastating. At the start of the dance, there had been nearly 20 dragons alive, perhaps as many as 20, if you counted the wild ones and the untamed. Some were ancient, like Vargar, who had been hatched during the time of Aegon the Conqueror. Others were young, like Syrax, the Golden Queen's mount, but by the end only 4 remained. Silverwing, the gentle dragon of Queen Alazan, had survived, but she was riderless and grieving. Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, had been claimed by the Dragonseed Hugh Hammer, and then fought on both sides before being wounded. He lived, but his spirit seemed broken. The cannibal, that feral beast of Dragonstone, had stayed hidden in his cave, feasting on the corpses of his own kind during the chaos. And then there was Mourning, a hatchling born, just as the war was ending. A small, frail creature with pale pink scales that seemed almost translucent in the dawn light. But Mourning was an anomaly, a fragile whisper of hope in a world that had forgotten what hope looked like. The other eggs that had been laid before the war, the precious clutches kept in the Dragonpit, had either been destroyed, lost, or turned to stone. The Targaryen maesters tried everything: warm fires, blood sacrifices, ancient rituals. But most eggs never quickened. When they did hatch, the dragons were stunted, sickly things, born with twisted wings and malformed jaws. They grew slowly, if at all, and many died within their first year. The great age of dragons was not merely wounded, it was poisoned at the root. The reason for this is bound up in the nature of dragon magic itself. The dragons had always been tied to the Targaryen bloodline, but they were also creatures of fire and wonder, sustained by a world that believed in them. The dance was more than a war. It was a betrayal of the sacred bond between rider and beast. Dragons had fought dragons, brother against brother, mother against son. The skies had burned with the flames of kinslaying, and the magic that had once shimmered around the Targaryens, like a second skin, began to unravel. The dragons sensed it. They felt the horror of what they had been forced to do. And in the aftermath, their numbers dwindled, not just because of battle, but because the very wellspring of their existence had been poisoned. For House Targaryen, the loss of the dragons was the loss of their divine aura. Before the dance, the Targaryens were more than kings. They were demigods, rulers by fire and blood, who could conjure beasts of legend to enforce their will. Lords and small folk alike knelt not just out of fear, but out of awe. The dragons made the Targaryens seem eternal, untouchable, almost otherworldly. But the dance shattered that illusion. The world had seen dragons killing dragons. It had seen a teenage boy on a massive beast burn a city to ash. It had seen a queen fed to a monster in front of her own son. The mystique evaporated. The Targaryens were revealed as all too human, petty, cruel, and mortal. And when the dragons died, the crown lost its most potent symbol of divine right. The long-term consequences of this loss were profound. Without dragons, the Targaryen dynasty became vulnerable. Rebellions that would have been crushed in an afternoon now required years of bloody campaigning. The great houses, who had once feared the king's dragons more than any army, began to test their boundaries. The Dornish, who had never been truly conquered, grew bolder. The faith of the Seven, which had once been cowed by dragonfire, found its voice again. The Targaryens could no longer simply say the word and have their enemies turn to ash. They had to rule through politics, marriage alliances, and the sword. And they were not especially skilled at any of those. The seeds of the dynasty's eventual fall, centuries later under a mad king named Aerys II, were sown in the ash and blood of the dance. But perhaps the most haunting legacy was the silence. For centuries, the skies of Westeros had been filled with the beating of leathery wings, the roar of flame, and the shadow of passing dragons. That sound was as familiar as the wind. Now there was only emptiness. The Targaryens themselves seemed diminished, hollowed out. Aegon III, the broken king, could not bear to look at a dragon. He would not allow a single egg to be brought into his presence, and he ordered the remaining dragons confined to the Dragonpit, where they grew weak and languished. The last dragon of any size perished during his reign, a pitiful creature, barely the size of a horse, that was said to have died of grief. After that, only small stunted hatchlings appeared, and they too faded. The Targaryen bloodline continued, but the fire within it had cooled. The dance had not just taken the dragons, it had taken the Targaryens' sense of themselves. They became just another family of nobles, struggling to hold on to a throne that no longer seemed divinely ordained. And when the time came for the dynasty to face its final challenge, a winter of war and ice, it did so with not a single dragon left to offer. The song of ice and fire had been sung, but the verses were written in ash and mourning. And so we come to the end of the Dance of the Dragons, not with a victory, but with a fading echo. The war had killed thousands, destroyed a kingdom, and erased an era. The Targaryens who survived were ghosts, haunted by the screams of their own. The dragons were gone, and the crown they left behind was not made of iron and gold, but of memory and regret. This is the dark legacy of the dance, the moment when House Targaryen lost its wings and the long fall began. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.